Welcome, weary traveller, to the story of John Marston, a tale not of heroic triumph but of quiet reckoning, where a man's past shadows follow him across dusty plains and into the tender moments of fatherhood. Tonight, we trace the path of someone who learned too late that running from yourself is the longest journey of all, and that redemption often comes not through grand gestures but through the simple choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Close your eyes and let the gentle rhythm of hoofbeats carry you through the American frontier, where one man's struggle to escape his nature became his greatest act of love. In the beginning, before John Marston became the man whose name would be whispered in equal measures of fear and respect across the territories of the American West, there was only a child whose earliest memories were painted in the grey tones of abandonment and the harsh realities of survival on streets that cared nothing for the dreams or hopes of those too young to defend themselves against a world that had already demonstrated its capacity for casual cruelty. The circumstances that led to his solitary existence in the alleyways and forgotten corners of frontier towns were never fully revealed to those who would later know him as a man, though the scars they left upon his character would influence every relationship and decision that followed in the decades to come. The boy who would become John Marston possessed neither the luxury of a stable home nor the comfort of adults who viewed his welfare as anything more than an occasional inconvenience to be managed when absolutely necessary, creating a foundation of self-reliance and emotional defensiveness that would serve him well in the dangerous years ahead, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible for him to trust in the permanence of love or the reliability of human connection. The streets that raised him were unforgiving teachers who instructed through hunger and cold, through the constant threat of violence from those who saw weakness as invitation and youth as vulnerability to be exploited for whatever small advantage might be gained. Unlike Arthur Morgan, whose abandonment had come after at least some years of parental presence, John's earliest conscious memories were already tinged with the understanding that he existed outside the protective structures that most children took for granted, making his eventual integration into Dutch van der Linde's chosen family both more desperate and more suspicious than it might have been for someone whose capacity for trust had not been so thoroughly damaged by early experience. The skills he developed during these formative years were those of a survivor rather than a child. The ability to read the intentions and moods of adults whose attention might mean either temporary safety or immediate danger, the knowledge of which shadows offered the best concealment and which abandoned buildings provided the most reliable shelter from weather and hostile human presence. The hunger that was his most constant companion during these years was not merely physical, though the gnawing emptiness in his stomach certainly shaped his understanding of scarcity and the lengths to which desperation might drive even essentially decent people, but also emotional and intellectual, creating a void that would later make him particularly susceptible to Dutch van der Linde's combination of philosophical sophistication and paternal attention. The conversations he overheard between adults, the fragments of education he absorbed from discarded newspapers and overheard lessons, and his own primitive attempts to make sense of a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who lacked either wealth or the protection of powerful allies, all contributed to a premature sophistication about human nature that would serve him well as an outlaw, while making it difficult for him to ever fully embrace the innocence and optimism that characterized healthier approaches to human relationships. It was during one of the harshest winters in recent memory, when even the most resourceful street children were struggling to find adequate food and shelter, that fate intervened in the form of two men whose own relationship with conventional society had been severed by choices and circumstances that left them operating according to principles that bore little resemblance to those sanctioned by law or social respectability. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews were not merely criminals who happened to encounter a starving child, but rather philosophers of a sort who had developed their own understanding of what it meant to live with purpose and dignity in a world that seemed designed to reduce individual human worth to nothing more than economic utility or political convenience. Dutch, with his silver tongue and grand visions of a life lived according to principles of justice and mutual aid, rather than the grinding competition for resources that characterized most human relationships in the rapidly industrializing America of the 1870s, recognized in the suspicious and half-feral boy something that went beyond mere potential for criminal enterprise. Here was someone whose early experiences had stripped away the comfortable illusions about human nature and social fairness that made most people complicit in systems of exploitation and oppression, yet who had not allowed such disillusionment to destroy his capacity for loyalty or his fundamental desire for connection with others who shared his understanding of how the world actually operated beneath its veneer of civilization and moral righteousness. Hosea, older and perhaps more practical in his approach to human nature, saw in John not merely another mouth to feed or another potential recruit for their growing band of social outcasts, but rather a young man whose combination of intelligence and desperate need for belonging might be channeled towards something that resembled nobility if he were provided with the kind of guidance and stable affection that his previous circumstances had never allowed him to experience. The decision to take John under their protection was not made lightly or simply, as both men understood that incorporating a new member into their carefully balanced partnership would require adjustments and compromises that might threaten the delicate equilibrium they had established through years of mutual dependence and shared danger. The 12-year-old boy who found himself suddenly transplanted from the harsh uncertainties of street life into the complex dynamics of what Dutch grandly termed their family was not immediately grateful or trusting in ways that a simpler narrative might suggest, but rather cautious and calculating in his approach to these adults, who seemed to offer the security and affection he had always craved, while simultaneously demanding forms of loyalty and commitment that his previous experience had taught him to view with suspicion. The early months of his association with Dutch and Hosea were marked by a careful dance of testing and evaluation on all sides, as John attempted to determine whether their professed care for his welfare was genuine or simply another form of manipulation, while his new guardians worked to understand the full extent of the psychological damage that his early years had inflicted, and to develop approaches to healing and education that would address his specific needs and capabilities. The process of learning to read and write under Hosea's patient tutelage was not merely an exercise in basic education, but rather a form of therapy that gradually introduced John to ways of thinking and feeling that had been largely absent from his previous existence. As the world of literature and ideas opened possibilities for understanding human experience that went beyond the immediate concerns of survival and self-protection. The books that Hosea selected for his education were carefully chosen to provide examples of heroism and moral complexity that might serve as guides for a young man whose own understanding of right and wrong had been shaped by circumstances that offered few opportunities for ethical reflection or principled choice. Dutch's contribution to John's education was more philosophical and political in nature, introducing him to ways of thinking about society and justice that placed his own experiences of abandonment and exploitation within larger contexts of systematic oppression and economic inequality that affected millions of people who had committed no crime beyond being born into circumstances that offered few legitimate paths towards security and prosperity. The conversations that took place around their evening campfires were graduate-level seminars in social criticism and moral philosophy, though presented in language and through examples that a bright adolescent could understand and apply to his own developing understanding of what it might mean to live a life of purpose and dignity, despite operating outside the boundaries of conventional respectability. The physical skills that John mastered during his teenage years under the guidance of both men were not merely practical necessities for survival in their chosen profession, but also forms of discipline and self-development that built confidence and competence, while reinforcing lessons about the importance of preparation, practice, and attention to detail in all aspects of life. Learning to shoot with accuracy and speed was simultaneously an exercise in focus and patience, while developing the ability to track both animals and humans through various terrains provided insights into observation and deduction that enhanced his general intelligence and problem-solving capabilities. The early robberies and confidence games in which John participated were not simply criminal enterprises designed to generate income for their small group, but rather practical applications of the theoretical frameworks that Dutch had developed for understanding their activities as forms of resistance against systematic injustice, rather than simple theft or violence directed against innocent victims. Each operation was preceded by extensive discussion of its moral dimensions and strategic implications, creating an educational environment where John learned to think critically about the consequences of his actions while developing the skills necessary for executing complex plans under pressure. The relationship between John and Arthur Morgan during these formative years was characterized by the complex dynamics that often develop between siblings who have been brought together by circumstance rather than blood, as both young men competed for Dutch's attention and approval, while simultaneously developing genuine affection for each other that would survive decades of conflict and disappointment. Arthur's slightly older age and longer association with their adoptive family initially gave him advantages in terms of status and responsibility within their small community. Yet John's quick intelligence and natural charisma ensured that he would never be relegated to a permanently secondary position in Dutch's estimation or planning. The competitions between the two young men were generally friendly and productive, pushing both to develop their capabilities and understanding in ways that benefited not only their own growth, but also the overall effectiveness of their small organization. Arthur's superior size and physical strength were balanced by John's quickness and tactical intelligence, creating a partnership that proved highly effective in situations requiring both careful planning and decisive action when circumstances demanded immediate responses to unexpected complications or opportunities. As John matured from adolescence into young adulthood, his role within the gang evolved from that of student and junior participant to something approaching equal partnership with Arthur in terms of responsibility for planning and executing their various enterprises. Though Dutch's position as the intellectual and moral center of their community was never seriously challenged by either of his protégés, the respect and affection that John developed for both Dutch and Hosea during these years was genuine and deep, creating emotional bonds that would make his later disillusionment with Dutch's methods and judgment all the more painful when circumstances forced him to choose between loyalty to his adoptive father and responsibility to the biological family he would eventually create. The philosophical discussions that were a regular feature of their evening gatherings around the campfire provided John with intellectual stimulation and moral guidance that went far beyond anything he might have received through conventional education, as Dutch's wide reading and natural eloquence introduced him to ideas about justice, freedom, and human dignity that would influence his thinking throughout his life. even after events had forced him to question the practical applications of such principles when they came into conflict with the welfare of innocent people who happened to be caught in the crossfire of their war against systematic oppression. Hosea's more practical wisdom provided necessary balance to Dutch's sometimes grandiose theorizing, offering John examples of how abstract principles might be applied to specific situations in ways that minimized harm to bystanders, while maximizing the positive impact of their activities on communities that had been abandoned by legitimate authorities and left to the mercy of corporate interests and corrupt political machines. The older man's experience with the realities of frontier life and his understanding of human nature in all its complexity provided John with tools for navigating moral ambiguity and making difficult decisions when circumstances offered no clearly right or wrong choices. The young man who emerged from this unusual educational environment possessed a combination of intellectual sophistication and practical competence that would serve him well in the challenging years ahead, though the same experiences that had given him such advantages had also created psychological dependencies and emotional vulnerabilities that would make it difficult for him to imagine any future that did not involve continued association with the only family he had ever known. The identity that John had constructed during his teenage years was so thoroughly intertwined with his role within Dutch's vision of outlaw nobility that the prospect of ever living according to different principles or pursuing different goals seemed not merely unlikely but almost inconceivable. The loyalty that John felt toward Dutch and Hosea during this period was not the blind obedience that would characterize Arthur's relationship with their leader, but rather the deep affection and genuine respect that develops between people who have shared significant experiences and mutual dependence over extended periods of time. His gratitude for having been rescued from circumstances that might easily have resulted in his death or permanent degradation was balanced by his growing awareness that he had made genuine contributions to their shared enterprise and had earned his place within their community through merit and dedication rather than simply as the recipient of charity or condescending benevolence. By the time John reached his early 20s, he had become exactly what Dutch and Hosea had hoped he might become: an intelligent, capable, and morally serious young man whose commitment to their shared principles was matched by his ability to translate those principles into effective action when circumstances required decisive intervention on behalf of those who lacked the power to protect themselves against exploitation or oppression. Yet even as John thrived within the structure and purpose that the gang provided, the seeds of future conflict were already being planted in the form of desires and ambitions that would eventually require him to choose between the loyalty that had sustained him through his formative years and the possibility of creating something entirely his own. The transformation of John Marston from the grateful boy who had been rescued from the streets into the complicated young man who would struggle with the competing demands of loyalty and love was not a sudden metamorphosis, but rather a gradual evolution that unfolded across several years of increasing responsibility within the gang and growing awareness of possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of their chosen family. The skills and confidence he had developed under Dutch and Hosea's guidance had created a foundation of self-worth that no longer depended entirely upon their approval, while his natural intelligence and observational abilities had begun to reveal aspects of the world that their philosophical discussions and practical education had not fully prepared him to understand or navigate. It was during one of their more successful periods, when the gang had established a comfortable camp in the heartlands of New Hanover, and their various enterprises were generating sufficient income to allow for extended stays in one location, that John first encountered Abigail Roberts under circumstances that were both typical of their lifestyle and representative of the complex moral territory that all of them inhabited as people who lived outside conventional, social boundaries, while attempting to maintain their own standards of decency and mutual respect. Abigail had come to their attention through the kind of unfortunate circumstances that were all too common in territories where legitimate employment opportunities for women were limited, and the protection offered by law enforcement agencies was sporadic at best. The young woman who would eventually become the center of John's most profound internal conflicts possessed a combination of beauty and intelligence that had made her valuable to men whose understanding of such value was primarily commercial, yet she also carried herself with a dignity and self-possession that suggested reserves of strength and character that had not been entirely eroded by experiences that might have broken someone with less natural resilience or determination to maintain her essential humanity, despite circumstances that seemed designed to destroy such qualities. Her association with the gang began as a practical arrangement that offered her protection and security in exchange for domestic services and companionship. Yet the relationships that developed over time proved to be far more complex and emotionally charged than such simple transactions typically produced. John's initial response to Abigail's presence in their camp was characterized by the same wariness and careful evaluation that marked his approach to all new relationships, as his early experiences had taught him to be suspicious of emotional connections that might create vulnerabilities or obligations that could interfere with his primary loyalty to the family that had saved him from destitution and provided him with purpose and identity. The attraction he felt toward her was immediate and powerful, yet he was also acutely aware that pursuing such feelings might create complications that could threaten the stability and effectiveness of the gang's operations, while potentially placing both Abigail and himself in positions where their personal desires came into conflict with the collective needs of their community. The courtship that gradually developed between John and Abigail was conducted within the unique social environment of their outlaw family, where conventional moral standards and social expectations had been replaced by Dutch's philosophical framework and the practical necessities of their shared survival, creating opportunities for intimacy and connection that might not have been possible within more traditional circumstances, while simultaneously imposing constraints and complications that couples operating within normal society never had to navigate. Their relationship was observed and evaluated by people whose opinions mattered deeply to both of them, yet who possessed their own complex motivations and interests that were not necessarily aligned with the personal happiness or romantic fulfillment of individual gang members. Dutch's response to the developing relationship between John and Abigail revealed aspects of his character and leadership style that would become more problematic in later years, as his theoretical commitment to individual freedom and personal autonomy came into conflict with his practical need to maintain control over all aspects of gang operations and interpersonal dynamics. His philosophical discussions about love and human relationships were sophisticated and seemingly supportive of their right to pursue happiness according to their own understanding of what such happiness might require. Yet his behavior and decision-making often reflected a more possessive and controlling approach to managing the people he considered to be under his protection and guidance. Hosea's attitude toward John's romantic involvement was more supportive and encouraging, reflecting both his genuine affection for his adopted son and his more mature understanding of human nature and the importance of allowing young people to make their own choices about the direction of their lives, even when such choices might involve risks or complications that more cautious approaches would avoid. The older man's own experiences with love and loss had taught him to value authentic emotional connections when they occurred naturally, while his practical wisdom about the realities of their lifestyle provided him with insights into how such relationships might be sustained, despite the challenges and uncertainties that defined their daily existence. The other gang members' reactions to John and Abigail's relationship varied according to their own personalities and circumstances, with some viewing it as a positive development that might provide stability and emotional grounding for one of their most valued members, while others worried about the potential complications that romantic entanglements might create for operational security and group cohesion. Arthur's response was particularly complex, reflecting both his genuine concern for John's welfare and his own unresolved feelings about the sacrifices that gang loyalty required from all of them, in terms of personal relationships and individual desires that might conflict with collective needs. The physical intimacy that developed between John and Abigail was accompanied by emotional connections that went far deeper than either of them had initially expected or intended, creating bonds that would prove to be more durable and influential than the practical arrangements that had originally brought them together. Their conversations during quiet moments around the camp or during private excursions, away from the constant observation of their gang family, revealed intellectual and spiritual compatibilities that complemented their obvious physical attraction, while their shared experiences of hardship and uncertainty created the kind of mutual understanding and emotional support that characterizes the strongest human relationships. When Abigail became pregnant with Jack, both John and the gang as a whole were forced to confront questions about responsibility, commitment, and the future that had been largely theoretical up to that point, as the prospect of bringing a child into their dangerous and uncertain world raised moral and practical considerations that Dutch's philosophical framework had not adequately addressed. The decisions that would need to be made about how to provide for the child's welfare and security while maintaining the gang's operational effectiveness required forms of planning and compromise that challenged some of the fundamental assumptions about freedom and individual autonomy that had previously guided their collective choices. John's initial response to the news of Abigail's pregnancy was characterized by a mixture of joy and terror that reflected his genuine love for her and his equally genuine uncertainty about his ability to be an adequate father, while continuing to fulfill his obligations to the gang and to Dutch's vision of their shared mission. The responsibilities that fatherhood would impose seemed to conflict directly with the loyalty and dedication that gang membership required, creating an internal tension that he was not emotionally or intellectually prepared to resolve through any simple choice between competing obligations. The birth of Jack Marston represented a watershed moment in John's psychological and moral development, as the reality of holding his son for the first time forced him to confront the gap between his theoretical understanding of love and responsibility and the overwhelming emotional intensity of actually being responsible for another human being's welfare and development. The child who bore his features and would carry his name was simultaneously the greatest gift he had ever received and the source of his deepest anxiety about whether his lifestyle and character made him worthy of such trust and vulnerable love. The internal conflict that consumed John during the months following Jack's birth was not simply a matter of choosing between personal happiness and gang loyalty, but rather a more complex struggle with his own understanding of identity and purpose that had been built around his role within Dutch's chosen family over the previous decade. The man who had found meaning and self-worth through his contributions to their collective enterprise was now being pulled toward a different kind of meaning that seemed to require forms of commitment and sacrifice that might be incompatible with his previous understanding of what it meant to be loyal to the people who had given him everything he valued about himself. The denial of paternity that became John's primary defense against these overwhelming responsibilities was not simply cowardice or selfishness, though it certainly contained elements of both, but rather a psychological mechanism that allowed him to avoid making choices that seemed impossible to make without betraying either his love for his son or his loyalty to his chosen family. By refusing to acknowledge Jack as his biological child, John attempted to maintain his previous identity and obligations, while avoiding the full implications of what accepting fatherhood would require from him in terms of changed priorities and life choices. Abigail's response to John's denial was characterized by a combination of hurt, anger, and practical determination that reflected both her genuine love for him and her realistic assessment of what she could expect from a man whose entire adult identity had been constructed around his role within a criminal organization that viewed conventional domestic responsibilities as potential threats to operational security and individual commitment to their shared cause. Her decision to remain with the gang despite John's refusal to accept his paternal responsibilities demonstrated both her limited alternatives and her hope that time and circumstances might eventually force him to acknowledge what she believed to be his natural obligations to their child. The year that John spent away from the gang was not a simple matter of running away from responsibilities he was unwilling to accept, but rather a complex psychological journey during which he attempted to discover whether it was possible for him to construct an identity and find purpose outside the only family he had ever known. The territories through which he wandered and the people he encountered during this period of self-imposed exile provided him with perspectives on life and human relationships that had been unavailable within the closed world of their outlaw community, yet they also reinforced his understanding of how completely his sense of self had become intertwined with his role as Dutch's adopted son and trusted lieutenant. The loneliness and isolation that John experienced during his absence from the gang were more profound than he had anticipated, as his attempts to form new relationships and find meaningful work were constantly undermined by his inability to fully commit to anything that required him to abandon the possibility of eventually returning to the only life that had ever provided him with genuine purpose and belonging. The jobs he took and the people he met during this period were temporary expedients rather than serious attempts to build alternative foundations for his existence, as some part of him always remained focused on the gang he had left behind and the question of whether they would welcome him back if he chose to return. The guilt that accompanied John throughout his year of wandering was not simply about abandoning Jack and Abigail, though that certainly formed a significant component of his psychological burden, but also about betraying the trust and investment that Dutch and Hosea had made in his development and education over the previous decade. The man who had been rescued from the streets and given every advantage that love and careful guidance could provide, felt that his inability to resolve the conflict between personal desires and collective obligations represented a fundamental failure of character that called into question everything he had learned about loyalty and responsibility during his formative years. The decision to return to the gang was not the result of any clear resolution of the conflicts that had driven him away, but rather a gradual recognition that his attempts to find meaning and purpose outside their community had failed to provide him with satisfactory alternatives to the identity and relationships that had previously sustained him. The news that reached him about their activities and whereabouts during his absence made it clear that they had continued to function effectively without him, yet also suggested that his absence had created a gap in their operational capabilities and interpersonal dynamics that his return might help to fill. The reception that John received upon his return to the gang was more complicated than he had expected, reflecting the various ways in which his departure had affected different members of their community, and the extent to which his absence had forced them to adjust their understanding of loyalty and commitment to accommodate the reality that even the strongest bonds could be strained by competing obligations and personal crises. Arthur's anger and disappointment were the most obvious and painful consequences of his choice to leave, as his adopted brother interpreted John's departure as evidence that their shared experiences and mutual affection had meant less to him than his own comfort and convenience. Dutch's response to John's return was characteristically complex and philosophically sophisticated, combining genuine pleasure at being reunited with his adopted son with subtle expressions of disappointment and concern about the implications of his departure for the gang's understanding of loyalty and commitment. The conversations they shared about his experiences during his absence and his reasons for returning revealed Dutch's continued affection for John, while also making it clear that his previous status and responsibilities within the gang would need to be re-earned through demonstrated commitment and reliable service over an extended period of time. Hosea's reaction was more straightforwardly supportive and welcoming, reflecting both his natural empathy for human weakness and his practical understanding that young people often needed to explore alternatives before they could fully appreciate what they already possessed. The older man's willingness to forgive John's departure and to help him reintegrate into the gang's social and operational structures provided crucial emotional support during a period when John's confidence in his own judgment and character had been severely undermined by his failure to find satisfactory solutions to the conflicts that had driven him away. The relationship between John and Abigail, following his return, was marked by a complex mixture of renewed intimacy and persistent tension, as both of them struggled to find ways of relating to each other that acknowledged the pain his departure had caused, while also recognizing that the fundamental conflicts that had driven him away remained largely unresolved. Abigail's willingness to resume their relationship despite his abandonment demonstrated both her genuine love for him and her realistic assessment of her limited alternatives within their current circumstances. Yet, her guardedness and occasional expressions of hurt made it clear that trust would need to be rebuilt through consistent behavior rather than simply assumed based on his physical presence. Jack's response to his father's return was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation, as the child's natural desire for paternal attention and affection was complicated by his inability to understand why the man who claimed to be his father had disappeared for such an extended period, without explanation or regular communication. John's attempts to establish a relationship with his son were hampered not only by Jack's understandable confusion and wariness, but also by his own continued ambivalence about accepting the full responsibilities that fatherhood would require from him in terms of changed priorities and life choices. The year of absence had not resolved John's internal conflicts about the competing demands of gang loyalty and family responsibility, but had instead demonstrated the inadequacy of simply running away from difficult choices as a strategy for dealing with moral complexity and emotional uncertainty. The man who returned to the gang was more aware of his own limitations and weaknesses than he had been before his departure, yet he was also more determined to find ways of honoring both his obligations to his chosen family and his love for the woman and child who represented possibilities for happiness and fulfillment that existed outside the boundaries of their criminal enterprise. The reintegration process that followed John's return required adjustments and compromises from all members of the gang as they worked to accommodate his changed circumstances and emotional needs, while maintaining the operational effectiveness and interpersonal harmony that their survival and success required. The practical arrangements that were made for Abigail and Jack's care and security within their community represented attempts to balance individual desires with collective needs. Yet these arrangements also highlighted the fundamental tensions between the gang's commitment to freedom and independence, and the reality that some forms of human happiness require stability and conventional respectability that were incompatible with their chosen lifestyle. The months that followed John's return were characterized by his gradual acceptance of a modified version of fatherhood that allowed him to maintain his primary loyalty to the gang, while also acknowledging his relationship with Jack and his obligations to Abigail, creating a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that made it possible for their unusual family structure to function with some degree of stability and mutual satisfaction. The fishing trips and informal lessons that John began to share with Jack represented his tentative exploration of what it might mean to be a father within the constraints imposed by their circumstances, while his renewed intimacy with Abigail reflected their shared determination to make their relationship work despite the fundamental conflicts that his year of absence had revealed but not resolved. The psychological transformation that John underwent during this period was subtle but significant, as his experiences with departure and return had forced him to confront the reality that his happiness and sense of purpose were more dependent upon the people he loved than he had previously been willing to acknowledge, while also making it clear that finding ways to honor all of his important relationships would require forms of creativity and compromise that simple choices between competing loyalties could never provide. The man who had once viewed his obligations to the gang and his love for Abigail and Jack as fundamentally incompatible was slowly learning that human relationships are complex enough to accommodate multiple forms of commitment and affection, provided that all parties are willing to accept the limitations and complications that such complexity inevitably creates. The seeds of John's eventual transformation from reluctant father into devoted family man were planted during this period of reintegration and adjustment, as his daily interactions with Jack and Abigail gradually revealed the rewards and satisfactions that domestic relationships could provide for someone who was willing to invest the time and emotional energy that such relationships required for their fullest development. Yet even as John began to discover the joys of fatherhood and partnership, the fundamental tensions between his gang loyalty and family responsibilities remained unresolved, creating a psychological burden that would continue to influence his choices and relationships throughout the increasingly difficult years that lay ahead for all of them. The events that would ultimately destroy the carefully constructed world of the Van der Linde gang did not begin with the Blackwater massacre itself, but rather with the gradual accumulation of pressures and temptations that had been building throughout the final years of the 19th century, as the forces of modernization and federal authority increasingly encroached upon the territories and opportunities that had previously allowed organizations like theirs to operate with relative impunity across the vast expanses of the Pacian American frontier. Dutch's growing ambition and his philosophical conviction that their activities represented a form of noble resistance against systematic oppression had led him to plan increasingly audacious operations that pushed the boundaries of what even experienced outlaws considered prudent, while the success of their previous enterprises had created a dangerous overconfidence in their ability to outmaneuver law enforcement agencies that were becoming more sophisticated and better coordinated with each passing year. The Blackwater ferry job that Dutch had spent months planning and discussing with his most trusted lieutenants was conceived not merely as another robbery designed to generate sufficient funds for their continued survival and comfort, but as a grand statement that would demonstrate their superiority over the corporate interests and government agencies that sought to reduce free men to wage slaves and compliant citizens. The ferry that carried wealthy passengers and substantial cargo between the bustling port town and various destinations along the river system represented everything that Dutch's philosophical framework identified as legitimate targets for their redistributive justice, while the operation's complexity and potential rewards made it appear to be exactly the kind of challenge that would prove their continued relevance and effectiveness in a rapidly changing world. John's role in the planning and preparation for the Blackwater operation reflected both his restored status within the gang, following his return from his year-long absence, and his continuing development as one of Dutch's most capable and trusted operatives, though his participation was also colored by his growing awareness that such large-scale criminal enterprises carried risks not merely to himself but to Abigail and Jack, whose welfare had become increasingly important to him. Despite his continued reluctance to fully embrace the domestic responsibilities that fatherhood and partnership required, the tactical discussions and strategic planning sessions that preceded the operation provided him with opportunities to demonstrate his intelligence and commitment to their shared cause, while also forcing him to confront the reality that his choices and actions could have consequences that extended far beyond his own survival and success. The other gang members who participated in planning the Blackwater job brought their own motivations and concerns to the enterprise, creating a complex dynamic of competing interests and personalities that Dutch's leadership style was not entirely equipped to manage effectively when the stakes were as high as they had become. Arthur's unquestioning loyalty to Dutch and his faith in their leader's judgment provided solid support for the operation, yet his own growing doubts about the direction their activities were taking created undercurrents of tension that were never fully acknowledged or addressed during their preparatory discussions. Hosea's participation in the Blackwater planning revealed the extent to which even his usually cautious and pragmatic approach to their criminal activities had been influenced by Dutch's grandiose vision of what they might accomplish through one spectacular success that would provide them with sufficient resources to disappear into comfortable retirement or to establish themselves in territories where their past would not follow them. The older man's experience and wisdom had previously served as a moderating influence upon Dutch's more extreme impulses. Yet his own desire to see their chosen family achieve security and prosperity had led him to support an operation that his instincts warned him might be beyond their capabilities to execute successfully. The weeks of preparation that preceded the actual attempt on the ferry were characterized by an intensity and attention to detail that reflected both the complexity of the operation and the high stakes that all participants understood were involved in its success or failure. Every aspect of the plan was analyzed and discussed repeatedly, from the timing and positioning of various team members to the escape routes and contingency plans that would be necessary if complications arose during the execution phase. Yet for all their careful preparation, none of them fully anticipated the series of catastrophic failures and unexpected complications that would transform their planned robbery into a massacre that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. The morning of the Blackwater operation dawned clear and calm, providing ideal conditions for the kind of precise coordination and careful timing that their plan required. Yet the very perfection of the weather seemed to carry with it an ominous quality that several gang members later remembered as having created a sense of unease that they were unable to articulate or explain at the time. John's preparations for his role in the operation were methodical and thorough, reflecting both his professional competence and his growing awareness that the stakes involved in their criminal activities were becoming too high for casual approaches or improvised solutions to unexpected problems. The initial phases of the robbery proceeded according to plan, with each team member executing their assigned responsibilities with the kind of professional efficiency that had characterized their most successful operations in previous years. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the environment within which they were operating. creating conditions that their experience and expertise had not prepared them to recognize or respond to effectively. The ferry's passengers and crew responded to their demands with a level of panic and resistance that exceeded what their previous encounters with similar targets had led them to expect, while the local law enforcement response was both more rapid and more aggressive than their intelligence gathering had suggested was likely. What began as a carefully orchestrated redistribution of wealth from those who possessed it in abundance to those who needed it for survival quickly degenerated into a chaotic exchange of gunfire that left innocent bystanders dead and the gang members themselves fighting desperately for their lives against opponents who seemed to possess both superior numbers and better tactical positions than their planning had anticipated. The ferry that was supposed to represent their pathway to financial security and peaceful retirement instead became a floating battlefield where the philosophical principles that had previously guided their activities were abandoned in ferry to see do see, favor of the simple imperative of survival against overwhelming odds. John's experience during the Blackwater massacre was characterized by a combination of professional competence and personal horror that would influence his understanding of their chosen way of life for years to come, as he found himself simultaneously performing his assigned duties with deadly efficiency while witnessing the collapse of everything that Dutch's leadership and moral guidance had taught him to value about their criminal enterprise. The people who died during the operation were not the abstract representations of systematic oppression that Dutch's rhetoric had taught him to see as their natural enemies, but rather real human beings whose terror and suffering were impossible to rationalize away through appeals to higher principles or greater goods. The escape from Blackwater was a nightmare of pursuit and evasion that tested every skill and resource the gang possessed, while forcing them to abandon many of the comfortable certainties and familiar routines that had previously structured their existence as a cohesive family unit. The money they had risked everything to steal was scattered and lost in the chaos of their flight, while several gang members were wounded or separated from the main group during the desperate attempt to reach safety in territories where federal law enforcement agencies would have more difficulty coordinating their pursuit efforts. Arthur's behavior during the Blackwater massacre and its immediate aftermath revealed aspects of his character and his relationship with Dutch that would become increasingly important as the gang struggled to survive the consequences of their failed operation, as his absolute loyalty to their leader and his willingness to follow orders, regardless of their moral implications, made him both invaluable for their collective survival and increasingly isolated from gang members like John, who were beginning to question whether Dutch's judgment and leadership remained worthy of their continued trust and obedience. The flight from Blackwater took the surviving gang members through increasingly harsh and unfamiliar territories as they sought to put sufficient distance between themselves and their pursuers to allow for some degree of rest and Prussians' recovery. Yet the psychological trauma of what they had experienced during the massacre made it difficult for any of them to find genuine peace or security, even when their immediate physical safety seemed assured. The conversations that took place during their desperate journey were marked by recriminations and attempts to understand what had gone wrong with their carefully planned operation. Yet none of them were emotionally prepared to acknowledge the possibility that Dutch's vision of outlaw nobility had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The winter camp that the gang eventually established in the mountains above the town of Coulter represented both a refuge from immediate pursuit and a prison created by weather conditions that made further travel impossible until spring arrived to melt the snows and open the passes that would allow them to continue their flight toward territories where they might be able to re-establish some version of their previous existence. The months they spent in those harsh mountains tested every aspect of their relationships and their commitment to their shared survival, while also providing extended opportunities for reflection and analysis that many of them would have preferred to avoid. John's experience of the wolf attack that nearly killed him during their time at Coulter was simultaneously a random accident and a symbolic representation of how completely their comfortable assumptions about their ability to control their environment and protect themselves from external threats had been shattered by the Blackwater disaster. The severity of his injuries and the extended period of recovery that followed provided him with enforced opportunities for contemplation and self-examination that he might not have sought voluntarily, while also demonstrating the extent to which his survival and welfare depended upon the continued cohesion and mutual support of their gang family. The care that Abigail provided during John's recovery from the wolf attack represented one of the most sustained periods of domestic intimacy and emotional connection that their relationship had experienced since Jack's birth, as his physical vulnerability and dependence upon her attention created conditions where his usual defensiveness and emotional distance were impossible to maintain. The conversations they shared during his long weeks of healing revealed depths of feeling and mutual understanding that their previous interactions had only hinted at, while also forcing both of them to confront questions about their future together that they had previously been able to avoid through the distractions and uncertainties of their nomadic lifestyle. Arthur's response to John's injury and recovery was complicated by his own unresolved anger about John's previous abandonment of the gang and his continued refusal to fully accept his responsibilities as Jack's father, creating a dynamic where his genuine concern for his adopted brother's welfare was constantly undermined by his disappointment and frustration with John's character and choices. The harsh words and critical judgments that Arthur expressed during this period were motivated not by simple dislike or cruelty, but by his desperate hope that pressure and confrontation might force John to become the kind of man that their family and their circumstances required him to be. Dutch's behavior during their extended stay at Coulter revealed the first clear signs of the psychological deterioration that would eventually destroy his capacity for effective leadership and moral guidance. As the stress and uncertainty of their situation combined with his wounded pride over the Blackwater disaster to produce an increasing paranoia and instability that manifested itself through erratic decision-making and a growing tendency to blame external forces rather than his own judgment for their current predicament. The philosophical discussions that had once provided intellectual stimulation and moral clarity for the entire gang became increasingly abstract and disconnected from the practical realities of their situation, while his treatment of individual gang members began to reflect favoritism and suspicion rather than the consistent care and guidance that had previously characterized his leadership style. The death of Jenny Kirk during their flight from Blackwater and the extended mourning period that followed her loss provided the gang with their first direct experience of how their criminal lifestyle could exact costs that went beyond simple material deprivation or temporary physical discomfort, as they were forced to confront the reality that the philosophical principles and mutual loyalty that had sustained them through previous difficulties offered little protection against the fundamental vulnerability that characterized all human existence in a world where violence and death were constant possibilities rather than abstract theoretical concerns. Hosea's attempts to maintain morale and group cohesion during their mountain exile were hampered not only by the practical difficulties of their situation, but also by his growing awareness that Dutch's psychological condition was deteriorating in ways that threatened their collective survival and individual welfare, creating a complex dynamic where his loyalty to his longtime partner came into conflict with his responsibility to protect the people who depended upon their leadership for guidance and security. The conversations that Hosea shared with individual gang members during this period were characterized by careful diplomacy and subtle attempts to prepare them for the possibility that significant changes in their organizational structure might become necessary if Dutch's condition continued to worsen. The gradual improvement in weather conditions that eventually made it possible for them to leave their mountain refuge was accompanied by a collective sense of relief and anticipation that masked the reality that their fundamental problems had not been resolved through their period of enforced isolation and reflection, but had instead been complicated by new tensions and unresolved conflicts that would make it increasingly difficult for them to function effectively as a cohesive unit once they resumed their nomadic existence and criminal activities. The gang that descended from the mountains toward the plains of New Hanover was fundamentally different from the confident and philosophically unified organization that had attempted the Blackwater robbery, though none of them were yet prepared to acknowledge the full implications of the changes that their shared trauma had produced. John's physical recovery from the wolf attack had been accompanied by a psychological transformation that was less obvious but potentially more significant than his visible scars, as his brush with death and extended dependence upon others had forced him to confront his own mortality and vulnerability in ways that his previous experiences had never required. The man who resumed his place within the gang's operational structure was more aware of what he had to lose through reckless choices and unnecessary risks, while also being more conscious of his responsibilities to the people whose welfare depended partly upon his survival and continued effectiveness as a provider and protector. The relationship between John and Jack during the months following their departure from Coulter was characterized by tentative attempts at connection, an understanding that reflected John's growing acceptance of his paternal responsibilities, while also acknowledging the damage that his previous emotional distance and periodic absences had inflicted upon his son's developing understanding of family relationships and masculine identity. The fishing trips and informal lessons that became regular features of their interaction were motivated not merely by duty or external pressure, but by John's genuine desire to know his child and to provide him with the kind of consistent paternal attention that his own childhood had lacked. Abigail's response to John's gradual transformation following the wolf attack was cautiously optimistic, reflecting both her genuine love for him and her realistic assessment of how difficult it would be for him to maintain his improved behavior and emotional availability when the pressures and distractions of their criminal lifestyle resumed with full intensity. The intimacy and partnership that had developed between them during his recovery represented the foundation for a more mature and sustainable relationship. Yet both of them understood that such progress could easily be undermined by the demands and temptations that their chosen way of life would continue to place upon his time and emotional energy. The psychological atmosphere within the gang during their descent from the mountains was characterized by a mixture of relief at having survived their ordeal and anxiety about what challenges awaited them in the territories below, where law enforcement agencies and rival criminal organizations might have spent the intervening months preparing responses to their eventual reappearance. The conversations that took place around their evening campfires were marked by attempts to recapture the intellectual stimulation and emotional warmth that had previously characterized their family gatherings. Yet the trauma of Blackwater and the stress of their mountain exile had created barriers to authentic communication that would prove difficult to overcome through simple goodwill and shared determination. Dutch's planning for their future operations following their departure from Coulter reflected both his continued commitment to the philosophical principles that had always guided their activities and his growing disconnection from the practical realities that would determine their success or failure in an environment that had become increasingly hostile to their continued existence. The schemes and possibilities that he discussed with increasing enthusiasm bore less and less resemblance to the kind of careful, achievable operations that had previously sustained their way of life. While his response to questions or concerns about feasibility and risk management became increasingly impatient and dismissive of perspectives that conflicted with his own optimistic assessments. The seeds of the conflicts and betrayals that would eventually destroy the Van der Linde gang were planted during their recovery from the Blackwater massacre and their subsequent exile in the mountains, as the trauma and stress of their shared ordeal revealed character flaws and philosophical contradictions that had previously been concealed beneath the surface of their collective loyalty and mutual dependence. John's growing awareness of these underlying tensions and his increasing concern about their implications for his family's welfare would gradually transform him from a loyal follower of Dutch's vision into a more independent, moral agent whose priorities and judgments might conflict with the demands of gang membership. When circumstances forced him to choose between competing obligations and loyalties. The transformation that would forever alter John Marston's understanding of what mattered most in his life did not arrive through philosophical revelation or gradual moral awakening, but through the sudden and terrifying prospect of losing the child he had spent years refusing to fully claim as his own. When Jack's kidnapping by the Braithwaite family forced John to confront the reality that his careful, emotional distance and deliberate ambivalence about fatherhood had been nothing more than elaborate forms of self-deception, designed to protect him from acknowledging how completely his heart had been captured by the boy whose existence he had treated as an inconvenient complication to his loyalty to the gang. The panic that seized him when Arthur brought word that Jack had been taken was not the measured concern of someone who felt obligated to care about a child's welfare, but the primal terror of a father whose world had suddenly contracted to encompass only the desperate need to recover what he had never consciously admitted was the most precious thing in his existence. The news of Jack's disappearance reached John during one of those peaceful evening moments around the Clemens Point campfire when the gang's various troubles and uncertainties had temporarily receded into the background, allowing for the kind of relaxed conversation and genuine companionship that reminded everyone why they had chosen to bind their fates together, despite the dangers and moral complexities that their way of life inevitably created. The interruption of Arthur's urgent arrival and his halting explanation of what had transpired during the failed attempt to recover the stolen gold from the Braithwaite manor transformed the comfortable domestic scene into a tableau of horror and desperate determination, as John's careful emotional equilibrium collapsed under the weight of possibilities too terrible to contemplate with anything approaching rational detachment. The immediate response that surged through John's consciousness was not primarily anger at the Braithwaites for their audacious crime against his family, though such anger certainly formed a significant component of his emotional reaction, but rather a crushing wave of guilt and self-recrimination, as he recognized that his own choices and behavior over the previous years had contributed to creating the circumstances that had made Jack vulnerable to being used as a pawn in conflicts that had nothing to do with the child's own actions or character. The boy who had been kidnapped was paying the price for his father's continued association with a criminal enterprise that brought danger not only to its direct participants, but to anyone unfortunate enough to be connected to them through bonds of blood or affection. The rage that followed close behind John's initial panic was directed not merely at the perpetrators of Jack's kidnapping, but at himself and at the entire structure of choices and assumptions that had led him to believe he could somehow maintain his position within the gang while also protecting his family from the inevitable consequences of their criminal activities. The philosophical framework that Dutch had taught him to use for understanding their actions as forms of noble resistance against systematic oppression seemed suddenly hollow and irrelevant when measured against the concrete reality of his child's terror and the uncertain fate that awaited Jack at the hands of people who viewed him as nothing more than leverage to be used in their conflict with the Van der Linde gang. Arthur's presence during John's initial response to the kidnapping represented both a source of practical support and a painful reminder of how completely John's previous behavior had undermined his credibility as a concerned father, since his adopted brother's skepticism about his sudden parental devotion was based upon years of observing John's deliberate, emotional distance from his son and his repeated refusal to acknowledge the responsibilities that paternal love should have imposed upon his choices and priorities. The questions that Arthur raised about John's commitment to Jack's welfare were not intended as cruel provocations, but as genuine concerns about whether this crisis would produce lasting changes in John's character or simply temporary emotional responses that would fade once the immediate danger had passed. The planning session that followed Arthur's report was characterized by an intensity of focus and determination that reflected not only the operational complexity of recovering Jack from his captors, but also the emotional stakes that had transformed a routine criminal enterprise into something approaching a holy war for everyone who cared about the child's welfare. John's participation in these discussions revealed aspects of his intelligence and tactical thinking that had been largely dormant during the years when his internal conflicts about fatherhood had prevented him from fully engaging with family responsibilities, while his desperate energy and single-minded focus provided leadership and motivation that helped to organize the rescue effort around clear priorities and achievable objectives. Dutch's response to Jack's kidnapping demonstrated both his genuine affection for the child and his continuing ability to rise to occasions that demanded the kind of decisive leadership and moral clarity that had originally made him worthy of his followers' loyalty and respect, though even his most supportive behavior during this crisis was colored by his tendency to view personal tragedies primarily as opportunities to demonstrate the gang's commitment to protecting its own members and punishing those who dared to threaten their chosen family. The philosophical justifications that he provided for their planned assault upon the Braithwaite Manor were not simply rhetorical flourishes designed to motivate the other gang members, but genuine expressions of his belief that Jack's rescue represented a higher moral imperative that transcended normal concerns about law and social convention. The other gang members' reactions to the kidnapping revealed the extent to which Jack had become not merely John and Abigail's child, but a beloved member of their entire extended family, whose welfare was viewed as a collective responsibility that superseded individual concerns about personal safety or operational security. The willingness of people like Charles, Sadie, and even Bill to risk their lives for the sake of a child who was not related to them by blood demonstrated the strength of the emotional bonds that held their community together, despite the philosophical and practical disagreements that were beginning to create tensions within their organizational structure. Abigail's response to her son's kidnapping was characterized by a combination of maternal fury and desperate faith in John's ability to bring Jack home safely, creating a dynamic where her own terror and helplessness were temporarily set aside in favor of providing emotional support and practical assistance to the rescue effort. The trust that she placed in John during this crisis was not simply the result of having no other options available, but rather a recognition that the man she loved was finally being forced to confront the full implications of his paternal responsibilities and that such confrontation might produce the kind of authentic commitment to their family's welfare that she had been hoping to see throughout their relationship. The assault upon the Braithwaite manor that followed the discovery of Jack's location was executed with a level of coordinated violence and tactical precision that demonstrated the gang's capabilities when they were united around a clear moral objective and freed from the philosophical complications that had begun to undermine their effectiveness during more routine criminal operations. John's performance during this operation revealed aspects of his character and abilities that had been largely hidden during the years when his internal conflicts had prevented him from fully committing himself to any course of action that required sustained focus and emotional investment. The moments immediately following Jack's rescue were perhaps the most emotionally intense of John's entire life up to that point, as the relief of discovering his son alive and relatively unharmed, combined with the overwhelming recognition of how close he had come to losing forever. The relationship that he was only now beginning to understand represented his best hope for genuine happiness and meaningful purpose. The embrace that he shared with Jack in the ruins of the Braithwaite manor was not simply the reunion of a parent and child who had been temporarily separated, but rather the beginning of an authentic father-son relationship that had been years in the making and had required the catalyst of almost unbearable loss to finally emerge from beneath the layers of fear and self-protection that had previously prevented its full development. The conversation that John had with Jack during their quiet moments together following the rescue revealed depths of feeling and commitment that surprised both of them, as John's careful emotional distance was replaced by an openness and vulnerability that allowed his son to see him not merely as a sometimes present adult whose attention was divided among competing loyalties, but as a father whose love was both genuine and permanent, regardless of whatever external circumstances might threaten their family's security or happiness. The stories that John told and the promises he made during this period were not casual expressions of temporary sentiment, but serious commitments that would guide his behavior and decision-making throughout the increasingly difficult months that lay ahead. The impact of Jack's kidnapping upon John's relationship with Abigail was equally transformative, as the crisis had forced both of them to set aside the accumulated resentments and unresolved conflicts that had complicated their interactions for years, in favor of focusing upon their shared love for their child and their mutual commitment to protecting him from further harm. The conversations they shared during Jack's recovery from his ordeal revealed possibilities for partnership and mutual support that their previous relationship had only occasionally approached, while also making it clear that sustaining such intimacy and cooperation would require continued effort and attention from both of them. The psychological aftermath of the kidnapping was more complex and longer lasting than the immediate relief of Jack's safe return might have suggested, as John found himself struggling to process the recognition of how completely his priorities and understanding of himself had been transformed by a few days of unimaginable terror and desperate action. The man who had spent years constructing elaborate justifications for his emotional distance from his son was forced to acknowledge that such distance had been motivated not by noble concerns about loyalty to the gang or philosophical commitments to their shared cause, but by simple fear of accepting responsibilities that would require him to acknowledge how much he had to lose if his choices led to consequences that affected people other than himself. The guilt that accompanied John's newfound commitment to fatherhood was not merely regret about his previous behavior, though such regret certainly formed a significant component of his emotional response to the crisis, but rather a deeper recognition of how his self-protective strategies had deprived both himself and Jack of years of relationship and mutual affection that could never be recovered or replaced. The time that had been lost while John convinced himself that maintaining emotional distance was somehow protective or noble represented opportunities for connection and influence that would have to be acknowledged as permanently gone, even as he committed himself to making the most of whatever future remained available to them. Dutch's reaction to John's transformation following Jack's rescue was characteristically complex, combining genuine pleasure at seeing his adopted son finally accept his paternal responsibilities with subtle expressions of concern about how such personal commitments might affect John's availability for gang operations and his loyalty to their shared enterprise. The conversations that Dutch initiated during this period were ostensibly supportive of John's newfound devotion to his family, yet they also contained implicit suggestions that such devotion should not be allowed to interfere with his obligations to the people who had invested years in his development and who continued to depend upon his contributions to their collective survival and success. Arthur's response to the changes in John's behavior and priorities was more straightforwardly positive, reflecting both his relief at finally seeing his adopted brother accept responsibility for Jack's welfare and his own growing understanding of how completely the gang's continued criminal activities were placing all of their loved ones at risk of experiencing similar traumas. The conversations that Arthur and John shared during this period revealed possibilities for genuine partnership and mutual support that had been largely absent from their relationship since John's return from his year-long absence, while also highlighting their shared concerns about the direction that Dutch's leadership was taking their chosen family. The weeks that followed Jack's rescue were characterized by John's intensive efforts to compensate for years of emotional absence through concentrated attention to his son's needs and interests, creating opportunities for genuine father-son bonding that had been largely theoretical during the previous period of their relationship. The fishing trips that became a regular feature of their interaction were not merely recreational activities, but rather extended conversations during which John attempted to convey lessons about life and character that he hoped might provide Jack with better guidance than his own childhood experiences had offered, while also discovering aspects of his son's personality and intelligence that his previous inattention had prevented him from recognizing or appreciating. The reading lessons that John began to provide for Jack represented both practical education and emotional intimacy, as the shared focus upon books and stories created context for discussion and reflection that allowed both father and son to explore ideas and feelings that might have been difficult to address through more direct conversation. The literature that they read together was carefully selected to provide examples of heroism and moral complexity that might serve as guides for a young man whose circumstances would inevitably require him to make difficult choices about loyalty and responsibility, while also offering John opportunities to examine his own values and priorities through the lens of characters and situations that illuminated the consequences of various approaches to life's challenges. The domestic routines that gradually developed around John's increased involvement in Jack's daily care and education provided structure and predictability that benefited not only the child but also John himself, as his commitment to being present for meals and bedtime stories and informal lessons created rhythms of family life that anchored his identity in relationships and responsibilities that existed independently of his role within the gang's operational structure. The satisfaction that John derived from these simple domestic activities was both unexpected and profound, revealing aspects of his character and desires that had been largely suppressed during the years when his self-image had been constructed primarily around his usefulness to Dutch's vision of outlaw nobility. Abigail's observation of John's transformation during this period was marked by cautious optimism, tempered by realistic awareness that sustained behavioral change would require ongoing effort and commitment that might prove difficult to maintain when external pressures and competing loyalties resumed their normal intensity. The conversations that she and John shared about their family's future and their individual hopes and fears revealed possibilities for partnership and mutual support that their relationship had previously approached only intermittently, while also acknowledging the practical constraints and moral complexities that would continue to shape their choices regardless of their personal desires and commitments. The impact of John's changed priorities upon his relationship with other gang members was subtle but significant, as his increased focus upon family responsibilities necessarily reduced the time and energy that he had previously devoted to purely social activities and informal conversations that had helped to maintain the bonds of friendship, mutual loyalty that held their community together. The choices that John made about how to spend his time and attention were not intended to create distance from his chosen family, yet they inevitably reflected a reordering of his priorities that some gang members interpreted as evidence of divided loyalty or diminished commitment to their shared enterprise. The philosophical discussions that had once been regular features of John's intellectual development under Dutch's guidance became less frequent and less central to his thinking, as his attention turned toward more immediate, practical concerns about how to provide his son with the kind of moral education and emotional support that would prepare Jack for whatever challenges his future might present. The abstract questions about justice and social responsibility that had previously seemed so important and engaging were gradually replaced by concrete concerns about character development and practical wisdom that had direct relevance to the daily challenges of raising a child in circumstances that offered few conventional models for successful parenting. The recognition that his son would inevitably be shaped by observing and imitating his father's behavior and choices created new forms of pressure and motivation for John's own moral development, as he found himself evaluating his actions, not merely in terms of their immediate practical consequences or their alignment with gang loyalty and criminal effectiveness, but also in terms of what kind of example they provided for a young man whose character was still being formed through observation of adult behavior and attitudes. The awareness that Jack was watching and learning from everything he did transformed even routine activities and casual interactions into opportunities for teaching lessons about integrity and responsibility that would influence his son's understanding of what it meant to be a good man in a world that offered few clear guidelines for ethical behavior. The growing tension between John's family responsibilities and his gang obligations was not yet openly acknowledged or directly addressed during this period. Yet it was clearly present as an undercurrent that influenced his decision-making and emotional responses to various situations that arose during their continued criminal activities. The recognition that his choices and actions could have consequences for people whose welfare had become more important to him than his own survival created new forms of caution and calculation in his approach to operations and conflicts that had previously been approached with the kind of reckless courage that characterized men whose primary loyalties were to abstractions rather than specific individuals whose lives and happiness depended upon their continued presence and protection. The seeds of John's eventual break with Dutch and the gang were planted during this period of intense focus upon fatherhood and family responsibilities, though the full implications of his transformed priorities would not become clear until circumstances forced him to choose between competing loyalties and obligations. The man who had once viewed his relationship with Jack as a potential threat to his primary commitment to the gang was slowly discovering that authentic love for another person could provide forms of meaning and motivation that were more powerful and enduring than any abstract principles or Collective enterprises, regardless of how noble or philosophically sophisticated such principles and enterprises might appear to be when examined from a distance. The Saint Denis bank robbery that would forever alter the trajectory of John Marston's life and irrevocably shatter whatever remained of his faith in Dutch van der Linde's judgment and moral authority began not with the operation itself, but with the months of increasingly desperate planning that preceded it, as Dutch's growing obsession with executing one final spectacular score that would provide the gang with sufficient resources to disappear into comfortable obscurity gradually overwhelmed his capacity for the kind of careful risk, assessment and practical consideration of alternatives that had previously characterized his approach to their criminal enterprises. The bank that Dutch had selected as their target represented everything that was most dangerous and ill-advised about their current trajectory, being located in the heart of a major city where law enforcement response times were measured in minutes rather than hours, and escape routes were limited by urban geography that offered few alternatives to main thoroughfares that could easily be monitored or blocked by coordinating authorities. John's participation in the planning sessions for the Saint Denis operation was marked by a growing sense of unease and foreboding that he found increasingly difficult to rationalize away through appeals to Dutch's superior experience and strategic thinking, as his own developing judgment and his newly awakened concern for his family's welfare combined to create forms of caution and skepticism that had been largely absent from his previous approach to gang operations. The tactical discussions that took place around their evening campfires revealed fundamental disagreements about risk management and operational security that Dutch was increasingly reluctant to acknowledge or address through the kind of open debate and collaborative decision-making that had previously characterized their most successful enterprises. Hosea's participation in the Saint Denis planning represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire enterprise, as his decision to support Dutch's increasingly reckless scheme was motivated not by confidence in its likelihood of success, but by his recognition that open opposition might result in his complete marginalization within the gang's power structure, leaving him unable to provide even the limited moderating influence that his decades of experience and hard-won wisdom might otherwise contribute to their increasingly desperate circumstances. The old man's private conversations with John during the weeks preceding the robbery revealed his deep pessimism about their current trajectory and his growing certainty that Dutch's psychological deterioration had progressed beyond the point where rational argument or gentle guidance could redirect their course towards something resembling sanity or sustainable criminal practice. The bond between Arthur and Hosea during this period represented one of the few sources of genuine moral clarity and emotional stability that remained available to gang members who were beginning to question whether their continued association with Dutch's leadership was compatible with their own survival and the welfare of people they cared about. Yet even this relationship was complicated by Arthur's unwavering loyalty to Dutch and his reluctance to acknowledge that their adoptive father's judgment might be fundamentally compromised by psychological pressures and character flaws that had been developing for years beneath the surface of his philosophical sophistication and charismatic leadership. The morning of the Saint Denis bank robbery found John experiencing levels of anxiety and premonition that went far beyond the normal pre-operation tension that any experienced criminal would naturally feel when contemplating a high-risk venture, as his accumulated experience and developing intuitive understanding of tactical situations warned him that they were walking into circumstances that had been designed to destroy them rather than provide them with the financial resources and strategic advantages that Dutch's optimistic planning had promised. The symptoms of dread and foreboding that he experienced were not simply nervous energy that could be channeled into effective action, but rather his unconscious mind's recognition that too many variables remained outside their control and too many contingencies had been inadequately prepared for in their rush to execute an operation that would demonstrate their continued relevance and effectiveness. The bank itself proved to be everything that John's pessimistic assessment had suggested it would be, representing not merely a financial institution that could be robbed through superior firepower and tactical coordination, but rather a fortress that had been specifically designed to thwart exactly the kind of operation they were attempting, complete with security measures and defensive positions that had been developed through years of experience with criminal enterprises and coordinated responses that could overwhelm even the most professional and well-equipped outlaw gunks. The guards and employees who awaited them inside the building were not the intimidated civilians that their previous successes had taught them to expect, but rather people who had been trained and equipped to resist robbery attempts through methods that the gang's planning had not anticipated or adequately prepared to counter. The initial phases of the robbery proceeded with deceptive smoothness that masked the reality that they were walking deeper into a trap that had been months or perhaps years in the making. As law enforcement agencies and financial institutions had clearly been developing coordinated responses to the kind of criminal activity that the Van der Linde gang represented, creating strategic disadvantages that would not become apparent until the gang members found themselves surrounded and outnumbered by opponents who possessed superior knowledge of the terrain and better communication systems than anything their frontier experience had prepared them to expect or counter. Hosea's death during the early stages of the confrontation with law enforcement represented more than simply the loss of another gang member to the inevitable violence that characterized their chosen way of life, but rather the severing of John's last connection to the moral and intellectual framework that had originally justified their criminal activities and provided meaning for the sacrifices they had all made in service of Dutch's Dirk, vision of outlaw nobility. The old man who had served as both mentor and surrogate grandfather to multiple generations of gang members fell not in the heat of glorious battle against overwhelming odds, but in a moment of confusion and chaos that demonstrated the complete breakdown of the careful planning and professional execution that had once characterized their most successful operations. The grief that consumed John as he witnessed Hosea's death was complicated by his immediate recognition that the loss represented not merely a personal tragedy, but also the symbolic end of whatever noble aspirations had once animated their collective enterprise, leaving behind only the hollow shell of criminal activity driven by desperation rather than principle, and sustained by violence rather than the community solidarity and mutual respect that had previously held their chosen family together through decades of shared danger and uncertain fortune. The man who had taught him to think critically about social justice and individual responsibility was gone, and with him disappeared the last restraining influence upon Dutch's increasingly erratic and self-destructive decision-making. The capture and imprisonment that followed the gang's failed escape from St. Denis marked the beginning of John's most profound disillusionment with Dutch's leadership and judgment, as the enforced separation from his family and the constant proximity to death created conditions for reflection and moral evaluation that his previous life had never allowed or encouraged him to undertake with the kind of sustained attention that genuine self-examination required. The chains that bound him in the St. Denis jail were not merely physical restraints, but symbols of the spiritual bondage that had characterized his entire adult existence. As he began to understand for the first time how completely his identity and sense of purpose had been subsumed into Dutch's grand design for their collective destiny. The fellow prisoners with whom John shared his incarceration represented a cross-section of the criminal underworld that provided him with perspectives on their lifestyle and its consequences that had been largely unavailable within the closed world of their gang community, as conversations with men who had chosen different approaches to life outside the law revealed both the advantages and limitations of the philosophical framework that Dutch had taught him to use for understanding their activities as forms of noble resistance against systematic oppression rather than simple criminal enterprise motivated by greed and self-interest. The rescue operation that Dutch organized to free John and the other captured gang members from Saint Denis demonstrated both his continued capacity for effective leadership when circumstances demanded decisive action and his growing tendency to view such operations primarily as opportunities to demonstrate his own cleverness and strategic superiority, rather than genuine expressions of concern for the welfare of people whose survival depended upon his choices and planning. The philosophical justifications that Dutch provided for their violent assault upon the jail were not simply rhetorical flourishes designed to motivate the rescue team, but genuine expressions of his belief that freeing his adopted sons represented a higher moral imperative that transcended normal concerns about law and social convention. The boat that was supposed to carry them to safety from the pursuing law enforcement agencies instead became the vehicle for their transportation to an island prison that would test every aspect of their relationships and their commitment to their shared survival in ways that their previous experiences had never required, as the tropical environment and foreign culture of Guam provided contexts for moral choice and character revelation that stripped away the comfortable rationalizations and familiar reference points that had previously allowed them to avoid confronting the fundamental questions about right and wrong that their current circumstances made impossible to evade through appeals to loyalty or practical necessity. The island of Guam itself represented a perfect microcosm of the larger world that Dutch claimed to be fighting against, complete with its own systems of oppression and exploitation that reduced human beings to simple economic units whose suffering was justified through abstract principles about progress and civilization that bore no relationship to the actual experiences of those who bore the costs of such development. The sugar plantation that dominated the island's economy was built upon the same foundation of violence and coercion that characterized the industrial enterprises that Dutch rhetorically opposed, yet his response to their situation revealed how thoroughly he had internalized the very attitudes and methods that he claimed to despise. Colonel Foussard's regime on Guam provided Dutch with opportunities to demonstrate his approach to dealing with systematic oppression when he possessed sufficient firepower and tactical advantages to impose his will through violence, rather than having to rely upon the kind of careful planning and strategic thinking that had previously characterized their most successful criminal enterprises. The casual brutality that Dutch displayed toward the island's inhabitants was not some temporary aberration brought on by extreme circumstances, but rather the logical culmination of attitudes and tendencies that had been developing for years beneath the surface of his philosophical sophistication and revolutionary rhetoric. John's growing horror at Dutch's behavior during their island exile was intensified by his recognition that this was not some dramatic transformation brought about by the stress of their current predicament, but rather the emergence of character traits and moral blindness that had always existed within their leader, but had been concealed by circumstances that had never previously required him to exercise absolute power over people whose welfare. He did not have to consider, in his decision-making processes, the man who was casually ordering the deaths of innocent civilians, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was the same person who had rescued John from childhood destitution and taught him to value justice and human dignity above material comfort or social respectability. The psychological pressure of witnessing Dutch's moral deterioration, while being powerless to prevent or significantly influence it, was compounded by John's growing awareness that their isolation on Guarma had effectively severed their connection to Abigail and Jack, whose welfare and security had become his primary concerns, following the traumatic experience of his son's kidnapping and the personal transformation that had resulted from that crisis. The uncertainty about whether his family had survived their separation and whether he would ever see them again created forms of emotional torture that made even their physical hardships and immediate dangers seem secondary to the larger question of whether his newfound commitment to fatherhood would prove to be meaningful or simply another form of self-deception. The forced labor and constant surveillance that characterized their existence on Guarma provided John with extended opportunities for reflection and self-examination that gradually clarified his understanding of how completely his previous choices had been shaped by his desperate need for belonging and approval, rather than any genuine commitment to the principles and values that Dutch had taught him to articulate as justifications for their criminal activities. The man who had spent years defining himself through his loyalty to the gang was slowly discovering that such loyalty had been based more upon emotional dependence and fear of abandonment than upon rational evaluation of whether their shared enterprise was worthy of the sacrifices it demanded from its participants. The escape from Guarma that Dutch orchestrated through a combination of violence and manipulation left dozens of innocent people dead while accomplishing nothing more than the temporary liberation of a handful of criminals whose continued freedom would likely result in even more suffering for the communities they would inevitably victimize during their future operations. The boat that carried them away from the island was loaded not merely with their physical bodies, but with the accumulated weight of moral compromises that had transformed them from whatever noble aspirations had once motivated their rebellion against established authority into simple predators, whose justifications had become increasingly hollow and self-serving. The return journey to America provided John with extended opportunities for contemplation and evaluation that gradually clarified his understanding of how far their collective choices had deviated from anything that could be justified through appeals to higher principles or greater goods, while simultaneously forcing him to confront the question of what, if anything, could be done to salvage some meaning from the wreckage of their shared enterprise, before it was too late to protect the people whose welfare had become more important to him than his own survival, or the abstract ideals that had once seemed so compelling and morally significant. The reunion with Abigail and Jack following their return from Guarma was simultaneously the most emotionally intense and the most morally clarifying experience of John's life up to that point, as the relief of discovering his family alive and relatively unharmed, combined with his recognition of how completely his priorities and understanding of himself had been transformed by months of witnessing Dutch's descent into casual brutality and philosophical bankruptcy. The embrace that he shared with his son represented not merely the reunion of family members who had been temporarily separated, but rather his definitive acceptance of responsibilities and commitments that would guide his behavior and decision-making, regardless of whatever conflicts such commitments might create with his previous obligations to the gang. The stories that Jack told about their experiences during his absence revealed how much his son had grown and changed during their separation. while also demonstrating the resilience and intelligence that would serve Jack well regardless of whatever challenges his future might present. The conversations that father and son shared during their reunion were marked by a level of emotional intimacy and mutual understanding that had been largely absent from their previous relationship, reflecting John's transformed understanding of what fatherhood required from him in terms of presence and attention and commitment to his child's welfare above all other considerations. Abigail's response to John's return was cautiously optimistic, reflecting both her relief at having her family reunited and her realistic assessment of whether his apparent transformation would prove to be lasting or simply another temporary response to crisis that would fade when the immediate emotional pressures subsided and the familiar patterns of gang life resumed their influence upon his choices and behavior. The conversations they shared about their future together revealed possibilities for genuine partnership and mutual support that their relationship had previously achieved only intermittently, while also acknowledging the practical constraints and moral complexities that would continue to shape their options regardless of their personal desires and individual commitments. Dutch's reaction to John's obvious prioritization of family concerns over gang loyalty during the period following their return from Guam represented the first clear indication that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by their shared experiences, and that the trust and mutual respect that had previously characterized their father-son bond had been replaced by suspicion and resentment that would make effective cooperation increasingly difficult as circumstances forced them to confront the reality that their understanding of loyalty and responsibility had diverged beyond the possibility of reconciliation through discussion or compromise. The philosophical discussions that had once provided intellectual stimulation and moral guidance for John's development were now revealed to be hollow exercises in self-justification and manipulation, as Dutch's responses to questions about their activities on Guam and their implications for their future operations demonstrated his complete inability to acknowledge the moral dimensions of their choices or to accept responsibility for the consequences that such choices had produced for innocent people whose suffering served no purpose beyond the temporary satisfaction of Dutch's need to demonstrate his power and superiority over those who lacked the resources to resist his will. The seeds of the final confrontation that would eventually destroy the Van der Linde gang were planted during their return from Guam, as John's growing awareness of the gap between Dutch's noble rhetoric and his actual behavior created psychological conditions that made it impossible for him to continue participating in their criminal enterprise without constantly confronting questions about complicity and moral responsibility that his previous loyalty and emotional dependence had allowed him to avoid through appeals to collective solidarity and shared purposes that no longer seemed either genuine or worthy of the sacrifices they demanded from their participants and the innocent people who suffered as collateral damage in their war against established authority and conventional morality. The final unraveling of the Van der Linde gang did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe that could be attributed to external enemies or unforeseen circumstances, but rather as the inevitable consequence of internal contradictions and moral compromises that had been accumulating for years beneath the surface of Dutch's philosophical rhetoric and the gang members' collective commitment to their shared enterprise, creating conditions where every choice and every response to crisis served only to accelerate their descent toward a form of destruction that would consume not merely their criminal organization, but the very relationships and principles that had once given meaning to their rebellion against the established order. The camp at Beaver Hollow that Dutch had selected as their refuge following their return from Guam represented everything that their noble experiment in outlaw brotherhood had ultimately produced: a collection of desperate and increasingly paranoid individuals whose trust in each other and in their leader's judgment had been so thoroughly eroded that they could no longer function as a cohesive unit capable of protecting themselves or achieving any objectives beyond simple survival through whatever means proved expedient. John's growing discomfort with the atmosphere of suspicion and recrimination that characterized their daily existence at Beaver Hollow was intensified by his recognition that the psychological dynamics poisoning their community were not temporary responses to external pressure, but rather the natural result of years of moral compromise and self-deception, finally reaching the point where they could no longer be concealed beneath appeals to loyalty and collective purpose. The conversations that took place around their evening campfires were marked by accusation and defensiveness rather than the intellectual stimulation and genuine camaraderie that had once made their shared meals and social gatherings sources of comfort and renewal, while the silences that increasingly replaced such conversations revealed how completely their capacity for honest communication had been destroyed by secrets and resentments that no amount of philosophical discussion could address or resolve it. Dutch's behavior during this period demonstrated the extent to which his psychological condition had deteriorated beyond the point where rational argument or appeals to their shared history could influence his decision-making, restore his capacity for the kind of moral leadership that had once made him worthy of their loyalty and respect. The paranoia that now characterized his interactions with even his oldest and most trusted associates was not simply a reasonable response to the very real dangers they faced from law enforcement agencies and rival criminal organizations, but rather a fundamental transformation of his personality that made it impossible for him to distinguish between legitimate concerns and the products of his own guilt and fear about the consequences of choices he was unable to acknowledge or confront directly. Micah Bell's growing influence over Dutch's thinking and planning represented perhaps the most visible symbol of how completely their leader's judgment had been compromised by psychological pressures that he lacked the emotional resources or intellectual honesty to address through the kind of self-examination and behavioral change that their situation desperately required. The man whose counsel Dutch increasingly sought and valued was not merely someone whose moral compass pointed in different directions from the principles that had once guided their collective enterprise, but rather someone whose fundamental understanding of human relationships was based upon manipulation and exploitation rather than the mutual respect and genuine affection that had previously held their chosen family together through decades of shared danger and uncertainty. John's attempts to counter Micah's influence were hampered by his recognition that direct confrontation would likely result in an open split within the gang that would destroy whatever remained of their community while accomplishing nothing positive for the people whose welfare had become his primary concern following his transformation during Jack's kidnapping and recovery. The subtle forms of resistance and alternative leadership that John attempted to provide during this period required levels of political sophistication and emotional restraint that his straightforward personality and growing moral clarity sometimes made difficult to maintain, particularly when his declining faith in Dutch's leadership made it increasingly challenging to participate in operations and discussions that he viewed as fundamentally misguided or actively harmful. Arthur's illness during this period added another layer of tragedy and complexity to the gang's deteriorating situation. As the man who had served as Dutch's most reliable enforcer and John's adopted brother was gradually being consumed by tuberculosis that made it increasingly difficult for him to fulfill his traditional roles within their Tubus community, while also forcing everyone who cared about him to confront their own mortality and the limited time that remained for resolving the conflicts and healing the relationships that had been damaged by years of accumulated stress and moral compromise. The coughing fits and physical weakness that increasingly characterized Arthur's daily existence served as constant reminders that their chosen way of life exacted costs that went far beyond the immediate risks of violence and imprisonment. The philosophical discussions that Arthur and John shared during this period revealed possibilities for genuine understanding and mutual support that their relationship had achieved only intermittently during their adult years. As Arthur's approaching death and John's transformed priorities created conditions where both men were finally able to acknowledge their deep affection for each other, while also honestly examining the choices and assumptions that had shaped their lives and relationships. The conversations they had about loyalty and responsibility and the meaning of family provided both of them with insights into their own characters and motivations that had been largely unavailable during the years when their competitive dynamics and unresolved resentments had prevented such authentic communication. Arthur's growing concern for John's family welfare during his final months represented both a natural expression of his love for his adopted brother and a form of spiritual preparation for his own death that allowed him to find meaning and purpose in circumstances that might otherwise have been characterized primarily by suffering and regret. The practical steps that Arthur took to ensure Jack and Abigail's security and the conversations he had with John about fatherhood and marriage demonstrated his understanding that individual redemption sometimes required sacrificing personal desires and ambitions for the sake of people whose happiness and safety had become more important than one's own survival or comfort. The failed train robbery that resulted in John being shot and subsequently abandoned by Dutch and Micah represented the definitive moment when whatever remained of their leader's paternal affection for his adopted sons was finally overwhelmed by his paranoia and his growing dependence upon advisors whose primary loyalty was to their own advancement rather than the collective welfare of their chosen family. The decision to leave John behind when he was wounded and vulnerable was not simply a tactical choice made under pressure, but rather a moral failure that revealed how completely Dutch's character had been corrupted by years of self-deception and the gradual replacement of genuine love for his followers with abstract devotion to principles that bore increasingly little resemblance to the lived experiences of the people whose sacrifices sustained his vision of outlaw nobility. John's experience of being abandoned by the people he had spent his adult life viewing as his primary family was simultaneously a devastating personal betrayal and a moment of moral clarity that stripped away the last vestiges of his illusions about the nature of their criminal enterprise and the character of its leadership. The physical pain of his gunshot wound was insignificant compared to the psychological trauma of recognizing that his loyalty and devotion had been directed toward people who viewed him as expendable when his continued presence became inconvenient or potentially threatening to their own survival and advancement. The rescue operation that Arthur organized to save John from the consequences of Dutch's abandonment represented both a practical necessity for John's survival and a symbolic statement about the difference between genuine loyalty based upon love and respect versus the abstract devotion to principles and organizations that Dutch's philosophy had increasingly emphasized over individual relationships and human welfare. The risks that Arthur accepted in order to ensure John's escape were not calculated based upon strategic considerations or potential rewards, but rather upon his recognition that some obligations transcend normal concerns about personal safety or practical consequences. The conversations that Arthur and John shared during their desperate flight from the pursuing law enforcement agencies were marked by a level of emotional honesty and mutual vulnerability that had been largely absent from their relationship during the years when competitive dynamics and unresolved conflicts had prevented such authentic communication. Arthur's acknowledgement of his own approaching death and his insistence that John focus upon protecting his family rather than seeking revenge against those who had betrayed them represented the final expression of wisdom and moral guidance that he was able to provide for his adopted brother before circumstances separated them permanently. The psychological burden that John carried as he witnessed Arthur's gradual decline and eventual death was complicated by his recognition that his own survival and his family's welfare had been purchased through Arthur's sacrifice, creating obligations and responsibilities that would influence his choices and behavior for the remainder of his life. The debt of gratitude that he owed to Arthur was not simply a matter of acknowledging past assistance, but rather a continuing commitment to live according to principles and priorities that honored the meaning and purpose that Arthur had discovered during his final months of moral transformation and spiritual growth. Dutch's final abandonment of Arthur during his last illness represented the complete culmination of his psychological deterioration and moral bankruptcy, as his inability to acknowledge the consequences of his own choices and leadership failures made it impossible for him to provide comfort or support for the man who had served him with absolute loyalty and devotion for decades. The philosophical justifications that Dutch constructed for his behavior during this period were not genuine expressions of principled thinking, but rather elaborate forms of self-deception designed to protect him from confronting the reality that his choices had systematically destroyed the lives and happiness of people whose trust and affection he had claimed to value above all other considerations. The grief that consumed John following Arthur's death was complicated by his growing awareness that mourning his adopted brother's passing was a luxury he could not afford, while his family remained vulnerable to the continuing threats posed by their association with the remnants of Dutch's criminal organization. The practical necessities of ensuring Abigail and Jack's safety and security required forms of planning and decisive action that left little time for the kind of extended emotional processing that the magnitude of his loss might otherwise have demanded. Yet the impact of Arthur's death upon his understanding of loyalty and responsibility would continue to influence his choices throughout the difficult months that lay ahead. The final confrontation between Arthur and Micah that John was forced to witness represented more than simply a conflict between two individuals whose approaches to their criminal lifestyle had proven incompatible, but rather a symbolic battle between different understandings of what loyalty and brotherhood should mean within their chosen family structure. Arthur's willingness to risk everything in order to expose Micah's treachery and protect John's family demonstrated the kind of selfless devotion that had once characterized the best aspects of their gang relationships, while Micah's casual betrayal of people who had trusted him revealed the corruption and moral emptiness that had gradually infected their entire enterprise. The inheritance of responsibility that John received from Arthur was not merely a matter of accepting practical obligations for his family's welfare, but rather the more complex psychological burden of carrying forward whatever remained worthy and noble from their shared experiences, while also learning to live with the knowledge that such nobility had been purchased through suffering and sacrifice that could never be adequately acknowledged or repaid. The gun and the journal that Arthur left behind were not simply material objects with practical utility, but rather symbols of the moral legacy that John was expected to honor through his own choices and behavior in whatever life remained available to him. The dissolution of the Van der Linde gang that followed Arthur's death was not the dramatic explosion of conflict and violence that simpler narratives might suggest. but rather the quiet unraveling of relationships and shared purposes that had been held together primarily through habit and mutual dependence. Rather than genuine commitment to common principles or authentic affection for each other's welfare, the people who drifted away from Beaver Hollow during this period were not deserting their chosen family, but rather acknowledging that such family had already been destroyed by forces that had proven stronger than their collective loyalty and individual determination to preserve what had once given meaning to their shared rebellion against forces. Established authority. John's decision to focus upon his immediate family's welfare rather than attempting to preserve or rebuild their criminal organization represented both a practical recognition of what was possible given their current circumstances and a moral choice about what kinds of relationships and responsibilities deserved his primary attention and commitment. The man who had once viewed gang loyalty as the highest form of honor was discovering that authentic love for specific individuals could provide forms of meaning and motivation that transcended abstract devotion to principles or organizations, regardless of how noble such principles and organizations might appear when examined from a distance or remembered from better times. The legacy that Arthur left behind in John's transformed understanding of fatherhood and family responsibility would prove to be more enduring and influential than any of the material wealth or strategic advantages that the gang's criminal activities had ever provided, as the lessons about sacrifice and genuine loyalty that Arthur had demonstrated through his final choices would continue to guide John's decision-making throughout the challenges and moral complexities that awaited him in whatever future circumstances might require him to choose between competing obligations and conflicting forms of love. The quiet moments that John spent with Jack and Abigail during the period following Arthur's death were characterized by a form of domestic intimacy and emotional connection that had been largely theoretical during the years when his primary identity had been constructed around his role within Dutch's vision of outlaw nobility. Yet these same moments also carried the weight of recognition that such happiness and peace were fragile achievements that would require constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice to protect against the forces that sought to destroy anything that challenged the established order's monopoly on legitimate violence and social organization. The government ultimatum that would force John Marston to confront the ultimate consequences of his criminal past arrived not through dramatic confrontation or violent assault upon his domestic tranquility, but through the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of federal agents whose understanding of justice was measured entirely in terms of operational outcomes and administrative convenience, rather than any consideration of individual circumstances or the moral complexities that had shaped the choices of people whose lives had been defined by their existence outside the boundaries of conventional law and social respectability. Agent Edgar Ross and his associates represented the inexorable machinery of state power that had finally decided that the remaining fragments of Dutch van der Linde's criminal organization posed sufficient threat to public order and federal authority that their elimination justified whatever collateral damage might be inflicted upon innocent family members whose only crime was loving people whose past actions had marked them for destruction. The seizure of Abigail and Jack as leverage to compel John's cooperation in hunting down his former associates represented both the betrayal of the implicit agreement that had allowed him to attempt building a legitimate life at Beecher's Hope and a demonstration of how completely the federal government's approach to law enforcement had abandoned any pretense of moral consideration or respect for the kinds of human relationships that gave meaning to individual existence, beyond simple compliance with institutional authority. The men who took his family were not motivated by concern for justice or public safety, but rather by their professional ambition and their institutional commitment to eliminating problems through whatever methods proved most efficient. regardless of the human costs that such efficiency might impose upon people whose welfare was viewed as irrelevant to larger strategic objectives. John's initial response to the government's demand that he capture or kill Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and Dutch van der Linde was characterized by a combination of rage at having his family threatened and desperate calculation about what choices remained available to him, given the complete absence of alternatives that would allow him to protect Abigail and Jack, while also honoring whatever loyalty he still felt toward men who had once been his brothers in everything but blood. The federal agents who presented him with this impossible choice were not interested in his internal conflicts or moral reservations, but rather in his demonstrated capacity for violence and his intimate knowledge of the people they wanted eliminated, making him valuable primarily as a weapon that could be directed against targets that conventional law enforcement methods had proven inadequate to address. The journey to Mexico that John undertook in pursuit of Bill and Javier represented both a geographical return to territories he had never expected to see again, and a psychological descent into moral ambiguity that would force him to confront questions about loyalty and betrayal that his domestic life at Beecher's Hope had allowed him to avoid through the comfortable routines of legitimate work and family responsibility. The landscape through which he traveled was marked by the scars of conflicts and betrayals that had occurred during his previous visit to the region, while the political situation that greeted his arrival demonstrated how completely the revolutionary idealism that had once seemed to offer hope for social justice and popular liberation had been corrupted by the same forces of greed, personal ambition that characterized all human institutions, regardless of their philosophical origins or stated commitments to higher principles. The Mexican Revolution that provided the context for John's hunt for his former associates had degenerated into a complex web of competing factions whose original disagreements about social justice and political reform had been largely replaced by simple struggles for power and resources that bore little resemblance to the noble causes that had once motivated peasants and intellectuals to risk their lives for the possibility of creating a more just and equitable society. The men who claimed to be fighting for freedom and popular sovereignty were revealed through John's interactions with them to be motivated primarily by their own advancement and their desire to replace existing forms of oppression with new systems that would benefit themselves and their supporters, while continuing to exploit and brutalize the very people whose welfare they claimed to represent. John's decision to work with both the federal forces loyal to the established government and the revolutionary armies that opposed them was not the product of any coherent strategic thinking or principled commitment to either cause, but rather a desperate pragmatic response to circumstances that offered no clear moral choices and no alternatives that would allow him to accomplish his primary objective of securing his family's release without participating in activities that violated his developing understanding of right and wrong. The moral compromises that this approach required from him were not abstract philosophical problems, but concrete decisions about whose suffering he was willing to ignore or contribute to in service of goals that had been imposed upon him by forces entirely outside his control. The relationship that John developed with Captain De Santa and the other representatives of the Mexican federal government revealed the extent to which his previous experiences with corrupt authority figures had prepared him to navigate systems where loyalty was purchased rather than earned, and where cooperation was sustained through mutual fear and self-interest, rather than shared principles or genuine respect for human dignity. The missions that he undertook on behalf of the federal forces were presented to him as legitimate law enforcement activities, designed to suppress banditry and restore order to territories that had been destabilized by revolutionary, violent, Yet his direct observation of their methods and objectives made it clear that such activities were actually designed to strengthen the grip of existing power structures while terrorizing populations whose primary crime was supporting alternatives to the systematic exploitation that characterized the established order. The village raids that John participated in under federal authority were not precise military operations designed to capture specific criminal targets, but rather exercises in collective punishment that were intended to demonstrate the consequences of supporting revolutionary activities, while also providing opportunities for soldiers to enrich themselves through theft and sexual violence, that their officers either actively encouraged or deliberately ignored as necessary incentives for maintaining discipline and effectiveness in difficult operational environments. The women who were rounded up during these operations were not treated as prisoners of war or even as criminal suspects, but rather as commodities to be distributed among the officers and men according to hierarchies of rank and favor that reduced human beings to simple objects whose suffering was viewed as irrelevant to larger strategic objectives. John's complicity in these activities was not the result of sadistic enjoyment or philosophical commitment to the methods being employed, but rather the consequence of his recognition that refusal to participate would likely result in his own death, while accomplishing nothing positive for the victims whose welfare he lacked the power to protect through direct confrontation with forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower. The moral trap in which he found himself was made more painful by his awareness that his presence and cooperation were being used to legitimize activities that he found personally repugnant. Yet his family's continued survival depended upon his ability to maintain the trust and cooperation of men whose understanding of loyalty was based entirely upon shared participation in criminal activities that created mutual liability and collective guilt. The houses that he was ordered to burn during the federal operations against suspected revolutionary sympathizers contained not merely the material possessions of families who had been displaced or killed, but also the accumulated memories and relationships that had given meaning to lives that were now being systematically destroyed in service of political objectives that bore no relationship to the actual welfare or desires of the people, whose homes and communities were being sacrificed to maintain existing power structures. The flames that consumed these simple dwellings also burned away whatever remained of John's illusions about the possibility of participating in government activities without becoming morally complicit in the systematic brutalization of innocent people whose only crime was existing in territories where their presence had become inconvenient to those who possessed superior firepower and institutional authority. The betrayal that John eventually discovered had been orchestrated by the very federal officials who had recruited his cooperation, revealed the extent to which his value to them had always been temporary and instrumental, as his knowledge of outlaw operations and his demonstrated capacity for violence made him useful for eliminating specific targets, while his own criminal background ensured that he could be disposed of once his usefulness had been exhausted, without creating complications or embarrassment for the agencies that had employed him. Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela had been under the protection of Colonel Allende and Captain De Santa throughout the period when John was being used to suppress revolutionary activities, creating a situation where his cooperation with federal forces was simultaneously helping to protect the very men he had been sent to capture, while also making him complicit in crimes against innocent civilians who had no connection to his personal objectives or family welfare. The discovery of this betrayal forced John to confront the reality that his attempts to navigate the moral complexities of his situation through careful calculation and limited cooperation had resulted not in protecting his family while Hossein minimizing harm to others, but rather in making him an instrument of systematic oppression, while failing to accomplish any of the objectives that had justified his original decision to accept the government's demands. The rage that consumed him upon learning that he had been manipulated and used was directed not merely at the specific individuals who had deceived him, but at his own naivety in believing that institutions whose power was based upon violence and deception could be trusted to honor agreements or respect the welfare of people whose continued existence served no useful purpose within their strategic calculations. The alliance that John eventually formed with Abraham Reyes and the revolutionary forces opposed to the federal government was not the result of any sudden conversion to revolutionary idealism or political sophistication about the causes of social injustice, but rather a desperate attempt to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of his previous cooperation with authorities who had proven themselves to be fundamentally dishonest and morally bankrupt in their approach to both their stated objectives and their treatment of people whose assistance they had solicited through false promises and deliberate deception. The revolutionaries who welcomed his defection from federal forces were motivated primarily by their recognition of his military value rather than any genuine concern for his personal welfare or moral development. Yet their cause at least offered the possibility of meaningful opposition to the systematic oppression he had witnessed and participated in during his period of cooperation with established authority. The combat operations that John undertook alongside revolutionary forces were characterized by the same casual violence and disregard for civilian welfare that had marked his previous activities under federal authority, revealing the extent to which all participants in the Mexican conflict had been corrupted by years of warfare that had gradually stripped away whatever moral constraints and humanitarian considerations might once have guided their behavior toward non-combatants and prisoners of war. The men who claimed to be fighting for popular liberation and social justice were willing to employ methods that differed little from those used by their opponents, creating situations where the suffering of ordinary people continued, regardless of which faction achieved temporary tactical advantages in specific regions or strategic objectives. Javier Escuela's eventual capture during the revolutionary operations represented both a personal victory for John, in terms of accomplishing one of his assigned objectives, and a moment of profound moral complexity, as he was forced to confront the reality of betraying someone who had once been his brother in everything but blood, whose loyalty to Dutch and the gang had been no less genuine than his own, and whose current circumstances were the result of choices and pressures that John understood from his own experience of trying to navigate impossible situations where all available alternatives required forms of compromise that violated fundamental principles of human decency and mutual loyalty. The conversation that John had with Javier during his capture revealed the extent to which both men had been damaged by their experiences since the dissolution of the Van der Linde gang, as Javier's bitterness about being abandoned by people he had trusted was balanced by his recognition that John's current actions were motivated not by personal animosity or philosophical disagreement, but by the same kind of desperate circumstances that had forced all of the surviving gang members to make choices that their younger selves would have found morally incomprehensible. The sadness that characterized their final interaction was not simply nostalgia for better times that had been lost through external circumstances, but rather grief for the destruction of relationships and principles that had once seemed permanent and unshakable, but had proven vulnerable to pressures that none of them had been prepared to recognize or resist effectively. Bill Williamson's death during the assault upon Fort Mercer represented the culmination of a personal and ideological journey that had taken him from the relatively principled criminal activities of the Van der Linde gang to the kind of mindless brutality and exploitation that characterized the worst aspects of frontier lawlessness. Yet his final confrontation with John was marked more by sadness than by anger, as both men recognized that their conflict was not really about personal grievances or competing loyalties, but rather about the impossible choices that life had presented to people whose moral education had never prepared them to navigate situations where survival required systematic violation of the principles they had once claimed to value above material comfort or social acceptance. The moral reckoning that John was forced to undertake following his success in capturing Javier and killing Bill involved not merely acknowledgement of the specific betrayals and compromises that these achievements had required, but also broader recognition of how completely his attempts to protect his family through cooperation with institutional authority had transformed him into exactly the kind of person whose existence he had once viewed as incompatible with human dignity and moral responsibility. The man who returned to American territory following his Mexican adventures carried with him not only the satisfaction of having accomplished his assigned tasks, but also the psychological burden of understanding that such accomplishment had been purchased through participation in systematic brutalization of innocent people whose welfare he had been forced to sacrifice for the sake of objectives that had been imposed upon him by forces entirely outside his moral consideration or practical control. The knowledge that one target remained before his family could be released from federal custody created a form of anticipatory dread that was complicated by his recognition that Dutch van der Linde represented not merely another criminal to be captured or eliminated, but rather the man whose philosophical guidance and paternal affection had shaped his understanding of loyalty and moral responsibility during his formative years, making the prospect of their final confrontation simultaneously a professional necessity and a form of spiritual suicide that would require him to destroy whatever remained of his connection to the principles and relationships that had once given meaning to his existence beyond simple survival and material accumulation. The final hunt that would complete John Marston's transformation from reluctant government agent into something approaching a free man began not with any sense of approaching liberation or moral resolution, but with the heavy recognition that Dutch van der Linde represented both his last remaining obligation to the federal authorities who held his family hostage and the most complex and emotionally charged target he had yet been forced to pursue, given that the man he was now required to capture or kill had once served as the closest thing to a father that his childhood circumstances had ever allowed him to experience. The psychological burden of hunting someone who had rescued him from street destitution and provided him with the philosophical framework and practical education that had shaped his understanding of loyalty and moral responsibility was complicated by his growing awareness that the years since their last encounter had likely transformed Dutch in ways that would make their inevitable confrontation even more painful and morally ambiguous than his previous meetings with Bill and Javier had proven to be. The intelligence-gathering phase of his pursuit of Dutch revealed the extent to which his former mentor had descended into forms of criminal activity that bore little resemblance to the principled rebellion against systematic oppression that had once characterized the Van der Linde gang's approach to their various enterprises. As reports from law enforcement agencies and civilian witnesses described a man whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and violent in ways that suggested complete abandonment of the philosophical constraints and humanitarian considerations that had previously distinguished their criminal activities from the simple banditry and mindless brutality that characterized less sophisticated outlaw organizations. The Dutch van der Linde, who was reportedly terrorizing settlements and killing innocent people for minor provocations or imagined slights, was not merely an older and more desperate version of the man John remembered, but rather someone whose psychological deterioration had progressed to the point where his actions were guided primarily by paranoia and rage, rather than any coherent understanding of right and wrong or strategic thinking about long-term consequences. The trail that eventually led John to Dutch's mountain stronghold was marked by evidence of casualties and destruction that demonstrated how completely his former mentor's activities had abandoned any pretense of moral justification or practical benefit for anyone beyond his immediate followers, as burned homesteads and unmarked graves testified to encounters with civilians who had possessed neither the resources to defend themselves effectively nor any meaningful connection to the forces of institutional authority that Dutch's rhetoric continued to identify as their primary enemies. The senseless violence that had characterized these encounters revealed a form of criminal behavior that was motivated more by psychological compulsion than strategic necessity, suggesting that whatever philosophical sophistication had once guided Dutch's decision-making had been replaced by the kind of impulsive brutality that characterized men whose capacity for rational thought had been destroyed by guilt and isolation, and the accumulated pressure of years spent living outside normal human relationships. The gang members who had remained loyal to Dutch during his descent into madness and isolation were not the kind of intelligent and principled individuals who had once been attracted to his vision of outlaw nobility, but rather desperate men whose own moral development had been arrested at levels that made them suitable companions for someone whose leadership style had degenerated into the arbitrary exercise of power sustained through fear and violence, rather than respect and genuine affection. The conversations that John had with some of these followers during his approach to Dutch's camp revealed the extent to which their continued association with their leader was based upon simple dependency and lack of alternatives, rather than any genuine belief in his wisdom or commitment to his stated principles, creating a dynamic where loyalty was maintained through intimidation and habit, rather than the kind of voluntary cooperation that had once characterized the van der Linde gang's internal relationships. The mountain terrain that Dutch had selected for his final refuge was both strategically defensible and symbolically appropriate. For someone whose psychological condition had led him to view all human contact as potential threat and all social interaction as evidence of conspiracy against his continued existence, as the isolation and harsh environmental conditions that characterized the location reflected his complete abandonment of the community-building activities and philosophical discussions that had once been central to his approach to criminal leadership and moral education. The camp that John eventually discovered was more fortress than family gathering place, with defensive positions and escape routes that demonstrated Dutch's expectation of violent confrontation while lacking any of the domestic comforts or intellectual amenities that had once made gang life attractive to people whose criminal activities were motivated by something more sophisticated than simple desperation or antisocial hostility. The initial contact between John and Dutch was characterized by a mixture of recognition and mutual wariness that reflected both their shared history and their accurate assessment of the current circumstances that had brought them together under conditions that made genuine reconciliation impossible, despite whatever affection might remain from their previous relationship as surrogate father and adopted son. Dutch's greeting was marked by the kind of philosophical rhetoric that had once provided intellectual stimulation and moral guidance for gang members. Yet the specific content of his speech revealed how completely his thinking had been corrupted by paranoia and self-justification that bore little relationship to the practical realities of their situation or the moral dimensions of the choices that had led them to this final confrontation. The conversation that followed their reunion was simultaneously an attempt to recapture something of their previous intellectual intimacy and a careful negotiation between two men who understood that their current loyalties and obligations made cooperation impossible, despite their genuine desire to avoid the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable, as their discussion revealed the extent to which their understanding of loyalty and responsibility had diverged beyond any possibility of reconciliation through rational argument or emotional appeal. Dutch's responses to John's attempts to convince him to surrender peacefully demonstrated his complete inability to acknowledge the consequences of his own choices, or to accept responsibility for the suffering that his actions had inflicted upon innocent people whose welfare should have been protected rather than sacrificed to his abstract principles and psychological needs. The philosophical framework that Dutch continued to articulate during their final conversation was not merely an older and more extreme version of the ideas that had once provided genuine insight into questions of social justice and individual moral responsibility, but rather a collection of intellectual fragments that had been reassembled in service of justifying behavior that violated every principle of human decency that his previous teaching had claimed to uphold, creating a form of moral reasoning that was sophisticated in its rhetorical construction yet completely divorced from any authentic concern for the welfare of real people whose lives were affected by the practical applications of such papal reasoning to specific situations and concrete choices. John's attempts to reach whatever remained of the man who had once rescued him from childhood destitution were hampered by his recognition that Dutch's psychological condition had progressed beyond the point where rational argument or emotional appeal could influence his decision-making or restore his capacity for the kind of self-examination that genuine moral development would have required. Yet his sense of obligation to their shared history and his hope that some trace of his adoptive father's better nature might still exist beneath the layers of paranoia and self-deception made it impossible for him to abandon such attempts without at least trying to offer alternatives to the violent resolution that both men understood was becoming increasingly probable as their conversation continued. The gang members who surrounded them during this final meeting represented not merely potential obstacles to John's successful completion of his mission, but also tragic examples of how Dutch's deteriorating leadership had attracted followers whose own moral development had been stunted by circumstances that had left them vulnerable to the kind of manipulative authority that promised simple answers to complex questions while requiring absolute obedience to commands that violated basic principles of human dignity and social responsibility. The loyalty that these men displayed toward Dutch was not the voluntary cooperation of equals who shared common values and mutual respect, but rather the desperate attachment of dependents whose survival and identity had become so thoroughly intertwined with their leader's approval that they were incapable of independent moral judgment or realistic assessment of their situation. The escalation toward violence that characterized the final phases of John and Dutch's conversation was not the result of sudden anger or impulsive decision-making, but rather the inevitable consequence of fundamental disagreements about the nature of loyalty and moral responsibility that had been developing for years beneath the surface of their relationship and had finally reached the point where they could no longer be concealed or managed through the kind of diplomatic compromise and mutual accommodation that had previously allowed them to maintain their connection. despite their different approaches to the practical challenges of criminal life and community leadership. Dutch's final speech before their confrontation turned violent was both a summation of the philosophical position that had guided his behavior throughout their association and a revelation of how completely that position had been corrupted by psychological pressures and character defects that had gradually transformed his genuine insights about social injustice into elaborate justifications for personal aggrandizement and the systematic exploitation of people whose trust and affection he had claimed to value above all other considerations. The words that he spoke were recognizably similar to the ideas that had once provided intellectual stimulation and moral guidance for John's development, yet their specific application to their current circumstances demonstrated how completely such ideas could be perverted when they were divorced from authentic concern for human welfare and genuine respect for the dignity and autonomy of individual people. John's response to Dutch's final attempt at philosophical justification was not the kind of extended intellectual debate that might have characterized their previous disagreements, but rather a brief and pointed rejection that demonstrated his understanding that words and ideas possessed moral significance only when they were connected to behavior and choices that reflected genuine commitment to the welfare of specific people whose happiness and security had become more important than abstract principles or organizational loyalty. The man who had once been eager to engage with Dutch's sophisticated theoretical frameworks had learned through painful experience that such frameworks were worthless when they failed to provide practical guidance for protecting innocent people from the consequences of violence and exploitation that were justified through appeals to higher purposes and greater goods. The gunfight that erupted following the breakdown of their negotiation was characterized not by the kind of tactical coordination and strategic thinking that had once marked the Van der Linde gang's most successful operations, but rather by the desperate improvisational violence of men whose psychological condition had deteriorated to the point where their behavior was guided primarily by instinct and emotion, rather than rational calculation about objectives and consequences. Dutch's followers fought with the kind of suicidal determination that reflected their complete dependence upon their leader's continued survival for their own sense of identity and purpose, while John's superior tactical skills and emotional discipline allowed him to systematically eliminate opposition while maintaining focus upon his primary objective of either capturing or killing Dutch himself. The moments immediately following the elimination of Dutch's remaining followers were marked by a strange calm that reflected both the physical exhaustion of extended combat and the psychological complexity of finally being alone with the man whose capture or death would complete John's obligations to the federal authorities, while simultaneously destroying his last remaining connection to the philosophical and emotional framework that had shaped his understanding of loyalty and moral responsibility throughout his adult life. The silence that fell between them was heavy with the weight of shared memories and mutual recognition of how completely their relationship had been transformed by circumstances that neither of them had been wise enough to anticipate or strong enough to resist when alternative choices might still have been possible. Dutch's behavior during these final moments revealed aspects of his character that had been largely concealed during their previous interactions, as the removal of his followers and the recognition of his inevitable defeat stripped away the performative elements of his leadership style and revealed someone whose fundamental understanding of human relationships was based more upon fear of abandonment than genuine concern for other people's welfare, creating a dynamic where his desperate need for validation and control had gradually overwhelmed whatever capacity he might once have possessed for authentic love and moral consideration. The philosophical rhetoric that had once seemed so compelling and intellectually sophisticated was revealed to be primarily a collection of defensive mechanisms designed to protect him from acknowledging the consequences of choices that had systematically destroyed the lives and happiness of people whose trust and affection he had claimed to cherish above all other considerations. John's final choice regarding Dutch's fate was not simply a practical decision about the most efficient method for completing his assigned mission, but rather a moral statement about the difference between justice and revenge, and between the kind of loyalty that honored genuine relationships versus the abstract devotion to principles and organizations that had been used to justify so much suffering and betrayal throughout their shared history. The mercy that John ultimately extended to Dutch was not based upon sentimentality or inability to acknowledge the extent of his former mentor's crimes, but rather upon his recognition that some forms of punishment were more appropriate to the complexity of their relationship and the tragic dimensions of Dutch's moral deterioration than simple execution would have provided. The aftermath of John's final confrontation with Dutch was marked not by the satisfaction of mission accomplished or the relief of family obligations fulfilled, but rather by the more complex psychological experience of recognizing that the completion of his government-assigned tasks had not resolved the fundamental questions about loyalty and moral responsibility that had been raised by his Bayesian, forced participation in activities that violated his developing understanding of right and wrong. The man who had successfully hunted down and eliminated or captured all of his former associates was not the same person who had accepted the government's ultimatum months earlier, as his experiences during the pursuit had forced him to confront aspects of his own character and capacity for moral compromise that had been largely hidden during his previous attempts to build a legitimate life at Beecher's Hope. The return journey to American territory following Dutch's death was characterized by extended opportunities for reflection and self-examination that gradually clarified John's understanding of what had been accomplished through his cooperation with federal authorities and what costs had been extracted from both himself and innocent people whose suffering had been necessary for the successful completion of operations that had been justified through appeals to law and order and public safety that bore little relationship to the actual motivations and methods that had guided the behavior of government agents throughout the entire process. The reunion with Abigail and Jack that followed John's successful completion of all assigned tasks was simultaneously the fulfillment of everything he had hoped to achieve through his cooperation with federal authorities and the PACIG's beginning of a new phase of his moral development that would require him to find ways of living with the knowledge of what he had been forced to do in order to secure his family's freedom and safety. The embrace that he shared with his wife and son carried with it not merely the joy of physical reunion, but also the psychological burden of understanding that such reunion had been purchased through participation in activities that had systematically violated the principles and values that he hoped to pass on to Jack as guides for living a promptless life of integrity and moral purpose. The domestic tranquility that gradually returned to Beecher's Hope following John's reunion with his family was both genuine achievement and fragile illusion, as the peace and happiness that they created together existed in constant tension with his awareness that such peace depended upon the continued satisfaction of government authorities who possessed the power to destroy everything he had built whenever their strategic calculations or political needs made such destruction appear advantageous to their institutional objectives. The ranch work and family activities that resumed their previous patterns provided structure and meaning for daily life, yet they were now colored by his recognition that external forces beyond his control or influence continued to pose threats that no amount of honest labor or domestic virtue could entirely eliminate or neutralize. The lessons that John attempted to provide for Jack during this period were not merely practical instruction about ranching and farming, but also careful efforts to pass on moral insights and ethical principles that might help his son navigate the kinds of complex situations and impossible choices that John's own experience had revealed to be inevitable aspects of life. In a world where individual virtue and family loyalty often came into conflict with the demands of institutional authority and social conformity, the conversations that father and son shared during their work together were opportunities for John to examine his own values and priorities through the lens of what he hoped Jack might learn and remember, while also acknowledging the limitations and contradictions that had characterized his own attempts to live according to principles that proved difficult to maintain when circumstances required forms of compromise that seemed to violate the very foundations upon which such principles were based. Abigail's response to John's transformation during this period reflected both her relief at having her family reunited and her realistic assessment of whether the changes she observed in his character and behavior represented genuine moral development or simply the temporary effects of trauma and exhaustion that might fade as the immediate pressures of their situation diminished and the familiar rhythms of domestic life resumed their influence upon his thinking and emotional responses. The intimacy and partnership that they rebuilt during these months provided foundation for a more mature and sustainable relationship than they had previously achieved. Yet both of them understood that such progress could easily be undermined by external forces and internal conflicts that their domestic happiness could not entirely resolve or transcend. The knowledge that his government handlers viewed his successful completion of assigned tasks as evidence of his potential value for future operations created forms of anxiety and uncertainty that prevented John from fully embracing the comms, peace and security that his family's reunion seemed to offer, as his experience with Agent Ross and other federal officials had taught him that institutional loyalty was based entirely upon immediate utility rather than any genuine concern for individual welfare or respect for the kinds of human relationships that gave meaning to existence beyond simple survival and material accumulation. The implicit threat that his cooperation could be demanded again whenever circumstances made his particular skills and knowledge useful to government objectives cast shadows over every moment of domestic happiness and made it impossible for him to believe that their current tranquility represented anything more than temporary respite from conflicts and pressures that remained beyond his ability to resolve through individual choice or family solidarity. The ranch that John continued to develop and improve during this period became both a symbol of his successful transition to legitimate life and a potential liability that could be used as leverage against him whenever government authorities decided that his continued cooperation was necessary for achieving objectives that his personal desires and family commitments might otherwise lead him to oppose or resist. The buildings and fences and livestock that represented years of honest labor and careful planning also represented vulnerabilities that could be threatened or destroyed if his refusal to accept future assignments made him more valuable as an example than as an asset, creating psychological conditions where every achievement and every source of happiness also carried with it awareness of what might be lost if circumstances required him to choose between competing loyalties and obligations that could not be reconciled through compromise or negotiation. The illusion of redemption and peaceful retirement that John attempted to maintain during this period was both psychologically necessary for his continued functioning as husband and father, and intellectually dishonest given his realistic understanding of how institutions like the federal government approached relationships with people whose past actions had marked them as potentially useful for future operations that regular agents might be unable or unwilling to undertake. The man who worked his fields and taught his son about honest labor and moral responsibility was also the man who had demonstrated his willingness and capacity to hunt down and eliminate people whose only crime was sharing his own criminal background, making him valuable precisely because of characteristics and experiences that his current domestic role required him to suppress or transform into more socially acceptable forms of expression and activity. The reckoning that had haunted John Marston's dreams for 3 years arrived not as the dramatic confrontation with his criminal past that he had prepared himself to face, but as the cold administrative decision of federal agents whose understanding of justice was measured entirely in terms of operational convenience and institutional self-preservation, rather than any consideration of the agreements they had made, or the human costs that their betrayal would inevitably inflict upon people whose only crime was believing that cooperation with government authority might eventually lead to the kind of peace and security that legitimate citizens were supposed to enjoy as their birthright. Agent Edgar Ross and his associates represented the inexorable machinery of state power that had finally decided that John's continued existence posed a greater threat to their professional advancement and bureaucratic efficiency than his potential value as an asset who might be called upon for future operations that regular law enforcement agencies were unable or unwilling to undertake through conventional methods. The morning that would become John's last began with the same domestic routines and family interactions that had characterized his daily life at Beecher's Hope for the previous 3 years, as he moved through the familiar patterns of ranch work and casual conversation with Abigail and Jack that had provided structure and meaning for his existence, while also serving as constant reminders of everything he had to lose if circumstances ever forced him to choose between his family's welfare and his own survival. The breakfast table conversations and shared plans for the day's activities carried no hint of the violence that was already approaching across the plains, yet John's accumulated experience with betrayal and institutional duplicity had created forms of underlying tension and constant vigilance that made it impossible for him to embrace domestic tranquility with the kind of complete emotional commitment that such tranquility seemed to require for its fullest appreciation and enjoyment. Uncle's presence at Beecher's Hope during this period represented both companionship and a living reminder of the criminal past that John had spent years attempting to leave behind, as the older man's stories and casual references to their shared experiences with the Van der Linde gang served to maintain connections to relationships and adventures that had shaped John's character and understanding of loyalty, even as he worked to build a legitimate future for his family that would not be compromised by association with people whose continued existence might be viewed as problematic by government authorities, who possessed the power to destroy everything he had worked to create through honest labor and domestic virtue. The conversations that John and Uncle shared during their quiet moments together were opportunities for both men to examine the meaning and consequences of the choices they had made throughout their lives, while also acknowledging the limitations and contradictions that had characterized their attempts to find redemption and peace through withdrawal from criminal activity and commitment to conventional moral standards. The approach of the Federal Army across the plains surrounding Beecher's Hope was conducted with the kind of overwhelming force and tactical coordination that demonstrated both the government's determination to eliminate any remaining traces of the Van der Linde gang's influence, and their recognition that John's demonstrated capacity for violence and tactical thinking made him sufficiently dangerous to require methods that went far beyond normal law enforcement procedures for apprehending individual suspects or serving legal warrants. The dust clouds that announced their arrival were visible from sufficient distance to provide John with time to recognize the nature of the threat and to make final preparations for a confrontation that he understood would likely result in his death, yet which also offered him the opportunity to demonstrate the kind of courage and self-sacrifice that might allow his family to escape, while also providing Jack with memories of his father's final moments that would serve as guides for the young man's own moral development throughout whatever challenges his future might present. John's immediate response to the sight of approaching federal forces was not panic or desperate attempts to flee with his family, but rather the calm calculation and decisive action that had characterized his behavior during the most dangerous moments of his criminal career, as he recognized that their tactical advantages and superior numbers made escape impossible, while also understanding that his primary obligation was to ensure Abigail and Jack's survival rather than his own. The instructions that he gave to his family during these final moments were not emotional declarations or philosophical statements about the meaning of sacrifice, but rather practical guidance, designed to maximize their chances of reaching safety, while also conveying his love and his hope that they would be able to build better lives than the circumstances of their current situation seemed to allow. The conversation that John had with Jack during these final moments was simultaneously a father's attempt to provide his son with moral guidance that would serve throughout his adult life, and a recognition that the boy would inevitably be shaped by witnessing his father's death in ways that no amount of protective intention or careful instruction could entirely control or predict. The embrace that they shared carried with it both John's love for his child and his desperate hope that Jack would somehow be able to learn from his example without inheriting the cycles of violence and retribution that had defined so much of his own existence. Yet John's realistic assessment of their situation made it clear that such hopes might prove to be nothing more than the wishful thinking of a man whose own choices had created circumstances where peaceful resolution was no longer possible. Abigail's response to John's final instructions demonstrated both her understanding of what was about to happen and her recognition that arguing with his decision would accomplish nothing positive while potentially wasting one precious time that might make the difference between their escape and capture by authorities whose treatment of his family would likely be determined by their usefulness as leverage or their potential value as examples to other criminals who might be tempted to believe that cooperation with government demands could lead to genuine amnesty and peaceful retirement. The kiss that she and John shared was both farewell and affirmation of the love that had sustained their relationship through years of uncertainty and moral complexity, while also carrying with it her forgiveness for whatever pain his choices had caused, and her recognition that his final sacrifice represented the fullest expression of the man he had become through their life together. Uncle's decision to remain with John rather than fleeing with Abigail and Jack was motivated not by any realistic assessment of their chances for successful resistance against overwhelming odds, but rather by his recognition that some situations required men to stand together regardless of practical considerations, and that his own advanced age and declining health made him more valuable as a companion in John's final moments than as a protector for family members whose survival depended upon speed and mobility that his physical condition would only impede. The loyalty that Uncle demonstrated during these final minutes was not based upon shared criminal history or gang obligations, but rather upon the deeper bonds of affection and mutual respect that had developed between men who had learned to value each other's companionship despite their different approaches to the moral challenges and practical difficulties that had characterized their post-outlaw existence. The defensive positions that John and Uncle established around the ranch buildings were not designed with any expectation of achieving military victory against superior forces, but rather as means of buying time for Abigail and Jack's escape, while also ensuring that their final stand would demonstrate the kind of courage and determination that might serve as inspiration for others who found themselves facing impossible choices between resistance and surrender to authorities whose promises could not be trusted and whose methods violated basic principles of human decency and constitutional protection. The tactical decisions that John made during the preparation phase of their final confrontation were guided by his accumulated experience with combat situations and his realistic understanding of what could be accomplished through superior positioning and accurate shooting against opponents whose advantages in numbers and equipment would eventually prove decisive regardless of individual skill or determination. The initial phases of the gunfight that erupted when federal forces reached the ranch were characterized by the kind of professional efficiency and tactical coordination that John had developed during his years as an outlaw. Yet the overwhelming firepower and strategic advantages possessed by his opponents made it clear that his resistance could only delay rather than prevent the inevitable outcome that both sides understood would result from their confrontation. The accuracy and speed that John demonstrated during the early exchanges of gunfire served both practical purposes in terms of reducing the number of opponents who could continue to threaten his family, and symbolic purposes in terms of proving that his cooperation with government authorities had not destroyed his capacity for effective violence when circumstances required him to defend principles and relationships that were more important than his own survival. Uncle's death during the middle phases of the battle represented both personal loss for John and symbolic confirmation that their cause was doomed regardless of their individual courage or tactical skill, as the older man's fall demonstrated how completely they were outmatched by forces that could absorb casualties and continue fighting, while they possessed no reserves or reinforcements that might allow them to sustain their resistance, beyond the ammunition and physical stamina that their initial preparations had provided. The grief that John experienced at witnessing Uncle's death was tempered by his recognition that such grief was a luxury he could not afford while the battle continued, and his family's escape remained dependent upon his ability to maintain effective fire against opponents who were systematically reducing his defensive capabilities through superior firepower and coordinated tactical movements. The gradual reduction of John's ammunition supplies and the systematic destruction of his defensive positions created psychological conditions where his continued resistance became more symbolic than practical, as his realistic assessment of the tactical situation made it clear that further fighting would accomplish nothing beyond delaying his inevitable capture or death, while potentially providing federal forces with opportunities to pursue Abigail and Jack before they could reach safety in territories where government authority might be less absolute, or where sympathetic individuals might be willing to provide assistance despite the risks that such assistance would create for their own security and welfare. The decision that John made during the final moments of the battle was not the product of sudden despair or recognition of defeat, but rather the culmination of careful consideration about how his death could serve purposes that were larger and more meaningful than simple resistance to overwhelming force, as he recognized that emerging from his defensive position would almost certainly result in his immediate execution, but would also provide federal authorities with the kind of dramatic conclusion that might satisfy their need for public demonstration of government power, while reducing their motivation to continue pursuing his family with the same intensity and resources that his continued survival would have required. The walk that John took from the ranch house toward the assembled federal forces was both an act of surrender and a final demonstration of the courage and dignity that he hoped would characterize Jack's memories of his father's final moments, while also representing his acceptance of responsibility for choices that had made peaceful resolution impossible despite years of honest labor and attempts to build a legitimate life that would not threaten institutional interests or challenge government authority through anything more dangerous than the example of successful rehabilitation and domestic happiness. The silence that accompanied his approach toward the agents who had come to kill him carried with it both his recognition of what was about to happen and his hope that his sacrifice would prove sufficient to purchase his family's continued freedom and safety. Agent Ross's behavior during these final moments revealed the extent to which institutional loyalty and professional advancement had replaced any consideration of individual justice or moral complexity in his approach to law enforcement, as his casual ordering of John's execution demonstrated his understanding that eliminating remaining traces of the Van der Linde gang's influence was more important than honoring agreements or acknowledging the genuine transformation that John's post-criminal life had represented. The cigar that Ross lit as he watched John's final moments was both practical convenience and symbolic statement about the routine nature of such executions within the context of government operations that were guided by strategic considerations rather than humanitarian concerns or respect for individual human dignity. The gunshots that ended John's life were not merely the culmination of his personal story, but also the final confirmation that cooperation with institutional authority provided no guarantee of protection or genuine amnesty for people whose past actions had marked them as potentially dangerous to government interests or bureaucratic efficiency, regardless of whatever evidence they might provide of successful rehabilitation or commitment to legitimate forms of social contribution. The blood that pooled beneath John's body served as testimony both to his courage in facing inevitable death without compromise or betrayal of his principles, and to the reality that individual virtue and family loyalty were insufficient protection against institutional power when such power was exercised without moral constraint or constitutional limitation. The aftermath of John's execution was characterized not by any sense of justice accomplished or public safety enhanced, but rather by the cold satisfaction of bureaucrats whose professional success had been measured by their ability to eliminate problems through whatever methods proved most efficient, regardless of the human costs that such efficiency might impose upon innocent people whose only crime was loving someone whose past had made him inconvenient to institutional interests and strategic objectives. The reports that would be filed about the operation would emphasize the successful elimination of the last remaining member of a dangerous criminal organization, while omitting any reference to the 3 years of peaceful ranching and family life that had preceded the decision to destroy everything that John had worked to build through honest labor and moral transformation. Abigail's discovery of John's body upon her return to Beecher's Hope represented both the confirmation of fears that had haunted her throughout their years together and the beginning of a new phase of her existence as a widow whose husband's death had demonstrated the futility of believing that love and domestic virtue could provide adequate protection against forces that operated according to principles that bore no relationship to individual justice or moral consideration. The grief that consumed her as she knelt beside John's corpse was complicated by her recognition that his sacrifice had indeed succeeded in securing her and Jack's survival, yet at a cost that made such survival feel more like punishment than liberation from the threats that had overshadowed their domestic happiness for so many years. Jack's response to his father's death was characterized by the kind of rage and desire for vengeance that John had spent his final years attempting to prevent through moral education and example that emphasized forgiveness and the importance of breaking cycles of violence that had characterized their family's history for generations. The young man who stared at his father's blood-stained body was simultaneously the child who had been taught about responsibility and honest work, and the son of outlaws whose legacy included both the capacity for love and the capacity, knowledge of how to use violence effectively when circumstances seemed to require such methods for achieving justice or protecting important principles and relationships. The burial of John and Uncle that Abigail and Jack conducted in the hills above Beecher's Hope was both a private ceremony of mourning and a symbolic statement about the persistence of love and loyalty despite institutional power and government betrayal, as the simple graves they dug with their own hands represented values and relationships that transcended political considerations and bureaucratic efficiency, while also serving as monuments to the reality that individual virtue and family solidarity were insufficient protection against forces that possessed superior firepower and legal authority to eliminate anyone whose continued existence was viewed as inconvenient or potentially threatening. The ranch that John had spent years developing and improving became both a memorial to his transformation from criminal to legitimate citizen and a burden that Abigail and Jack were ultimately unable to maintain without his labor and protection, as the isolation and memories that had once represented security and domestic happiness were transformed by his death into sources of grief and vulnerability that made continued residence at Beecher's Hope psychologically unbearable and practically unsustainable. The buildings and fences and livestock that had represented honest achievement and family stability were gradually abandoned as mother and son sought new homes and different lives that would not be constantly overshadowed by reminders of what they had lost through government betrayal and institutional violence. The legacy that John left behind was not measured in material accomplishments or public recognition of his successful rehabilitation, but rather in the moral lessons and emotional memories that he had provided for Jack during their brief years together as father and son, creating foundations for character development that would influence the young man's choices and behavior throughout whatever challenges his adult life might present. The fishing trips and conversations and shared work that had characterized their relationship provided Jack with examples of patience and responsibility and love that would serve as guides for his own approach to relationships and moral decision-making. Yet such positive influences were inevitably complicated by his witnessing of his father's murder and his realistic understanding of how institutional power operated when it was unconstrained by moral consideration or constitutional protection. The cycle of violence that John's death initiated was both the inevitable consequence of government betrayal and the tragic demonstration that individual attempts to escape criminal pasts through legitimate means were insufficient to break patterns of retribution and conflict that had characterized American frontier life for generations. Jack's eventual decision to seek revenge against Agent Ross represented both his love for his father and his inheritance of outlaw traditions that emphasized personal justice over legal process, creating conditions where the government's successful elimination of the Van der Linde gang's influence was revealed to have produced new forms of criminal activity rather than genuine peace and social stability. The irony of John's fate was that his genuine transformation from outlaw to legitimate citizen had made him more dangerous to institutional interests than his previous criminal activities had ever represented, as his example of successful rehabilitation and domestic happiness challenged government narratives about the impossibility of redemption. and the necessity of eliminating rather than reforming people whose past actions had marked them as threats to social order and political stability. The man who had posed no actual danger to anyone during his final years was killed precisely because his peaceful existence represented possibilities that institutional power could not tolerate without undermining justifications for the violent methods that had been employed to eliminate his former associates and to maintain control over territories where federal authority remained contested by alternative forms of social organization and moral loyalty. The silence that settled over Beecher's Hope following the departure of federal forces and the burial of the dead was not the peace of resolution or justice accomplished, but rather the hollow quiet of a place where love and hope had been systematically destroyed through the application of superior firepower to problems that might have been resolved through negotiation and genuine respect for constitutional principles that were supposed to protect individual citizens from arbitrary government action. The wind that stirred the grass around the simple graves carried with it both the memory of voices that would never again be heard and the promise that such memories would continue to influence choices and relationships in ways that institutional power could never entirely control or predict, ensuring that John Marston's true legacy would be measured not in the success of government operations designed to eliminate his influence, but in the love and moral guidance that would continue to shape his son's understanding of courage and loyalty long after the bureaucrats who had ordered his death had been forgotten by history and replaced by other officials whose understanding of justice would prove equally limited and morally bankrupt. And so ends the story of John Marston, a man who discovered that the hardest person to forgive is often yourself, and that love sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. His tale reminds us that redemption is not a destination but a daily choice, made not in grand gestures but in small moments of choosing family over freedom, responsibility over rebellion, and staying when running would be so much easier. John's legacy lives not in the violence of his past, but in the love that finally taught him to stand and fight for something greater than his own survival. The blood that soaked into the earth at Beecher's Hope carried with it more than the physical essence of a man whose journey from abandoned child to devoted father had encompassed decades of moral struggle and spiritual growth, but also the symbolic weight of dreams deferred and promises broken by institutions whose understanding of justice was measured entirely in terms of administrative convenience rather than human dignity or constitutional principle. The federal agents who walked away from his corpse represented forces that viewed individual transformation and domestic happiness not as evidence of successful rehabilitation, worthy of protection and encouragement, but rather as inconvenient complications that threatened bureaucratic efficiency and challenged official narratives about the impossibility of genuine redemption for people whose criminal pasts had marked them as permanently dangerous to oases, social order, and governmental authority. The ranch that John had built through honest labor and careful planning became both monument to his successful transformation from outlaw to legitimate citizen and testament to the futility of believing that individual virtue could provide adequate protection against institutional power when such power was exercised without moral constraint or respect for the agreements and promises that were supposed to govern relationships between citizens and their government. The buildings and fences that had once represented security and domestic achievement were gradually abandoned by Abigail and Jack, whose grief and vulnerability made continued residence at Beecher's Hope psychologically unbearable, while also demonstrating how completely John's death had destroyed the foundation upon which their family's happiness and stability had been constructed through years of shared labor and mutual dedication. Abigail's response to John's murder was characterized by a form of grief that went beyond simple mourning for a beloved husband to encompass recognition that his death had confirmed her worst fears about the reliability of government promises and the possibility of finding genuine peace and security through cooperation with authorities whose primary loyalty was to institutional interests rather than individual justice or human welfare. The woman who had watched her husband transform himself from irresponsible outlaw into devoted father and partner was forced to acknowledge that such transformation had been viewed by federal agents not as evidence of successful rehabilitation worthy of respect and protection, but rather as a threat to official narratives that justified the violent elimination of anyone whose continued existence might challenge bureaucratic authority or inspire others to believe that alternative approaches to law enforcement were possible or desirable. Jack's evolution from the protected child who had learned about responsibility and moral courage through his father's patient instruction into the angry young man whose desire for vengeance would eventually consume his own hopes for peaceful existence represented both the inevitable consequence of witnessing institutional betrayal and the tragic demonstration that cycles of violence could not be broken through individual virtue alone. When the broader social and political context continued to reward brutality and punish attempts at legitimate transformation, the boy who had been taught to value forgiveness and honest work was forced to confront the reality that such values provided no protection against forces that operated according to principles that bore no relationship to the moral lessons his father had tried to impart through years of careful guidance and loving example. The education that Jack had received during his childhood at Beecher's Hope had prepared him for a life of legitimate achievement and domestic happiness that his father's murder made impossible to pursue, as the trauma of witnessing government betrayal and the practical necessities of survival in a world that had demonstrated its hostility to his family's welfare created conditions where the peaceful alternatives that John had tried to model became psychologically and practically unavailable to a young man whose understanding of justice had been shaped by the gap between moral ideals and political realities. The books and lessons that had once seemed to offer pathways toward intellectual development and social contribution were replaced by more immediate concerns about protection and revenge that reflected the actual conditions of American life for people whose family histories had marked them as enemies of established order, regardless of their individual behavior or moral character. The legacy that John left behind in the journals and letters he had written during his final years provided Jack with insights into his father's internal struggles and moral development that helped to explain the choices and sacrifices that had characterized his transformation from gang member to family man. Yet such understanding also highlighted the tragic irony that John's genuine rehabilitation had made him more dangerous to institutional interests than his previous criminal activities had ever represented. The written record of his father's thoughts and feelings served both as source of comfort and as evidence of how completely individual attempts at redemption could be undermined by political forces that viewed personal transformation not as achievement worthy of respect, but as challenge to official authority that required elimination through whatever methods proved most efficient. The graves that marked the final resting places of John and Uncle on the hills above Beecher's Hope became symbols not merely of individual lives that had been cut short by government violence, but also of the broader failure of American society to honor its own proclaimed values of rehabilitation and second chances when such values came into conflict with bureaucratic convenience and institutional self-interest. The simple wooden markers that Abigail and Jack erected with their own hands represented forms of love and loyalty that transcended political considerations, while also serving as monuments to the reality that constitutional protections and legal agreements were meaningful only when they were defended by people who possessed sufficient power to enforce them against authorities whose primary commitment was to their own advancement rather than public welfare or individual justice. The wind that carried away the last echoes of gunfire from Beecher's Hope also scattered the seeds of future conflicts that would inevitably arise from government policies that prioritized elimination over rehabilitation and institutional convenience over human dignity, ensuring that John's death would contribute not to increased public safety or social stability, but rather to the perpetuation of cycles of violence that could have been broken through approaches that emphasized genuine justice and authentic respect for individual transformation and moral development. The silence that followed the federal agent's departure was not the peace of problems resolved, but rather the hollow quiet of opportunities, missed and possibilities, destroyed through the application of superior firepower to situations that might have been addressed through negotiation and recognition of common humanity. The irony that would haunt American law enforcement for generations to come was embodied in the recognition that John Marston's genuine transformation from criminal to legitimate citizen had represented exactly the kind of successful rehabilitation that official rhetoric claimed to value and encourage, yet his elimination had been ordered precisely because such success challenged institutional narratives that justified violent methods and bureaucratic approaches to social problems that might have been resolved through policies that emphasized human dignity and individual potential rather than administrative efficiency and political expediency. The man whose peaceful existence had posed no actual threat to anyone was killed because his example of successful change represented possibilities that institutional power could not tolerate without undermining the justifications for methods and policies that treated individual human beings as problems to be eliminated rather than citizens deserving protection and opportunity for moral growth. Jack's eventual decision to seek revenge against Agent Ross represented both his inheritance of outlaw traditions that emphasized personal justice over legal process and his realistic assessment that institutional authority could not be trusted to provide meaningful accountability for crimes committed under color of law, creating conditions where individual action became the only available alternative to accepting that government agents possessed unlimited license to destroy families and communities whenever such destruction served bureaucratic purposes or political objectives. The young man who had been raised to value education and legitimate achievement was forced to acknowledge that such values were luxuries that could only be afforded by people whose circumstances provided them with protection against the kinds of arbitrary violence that had characterized his family's experience with federal authority throughout his childhood and adolescence. The transformation that Jack underwent from promising student with hopes for professional achievement into embittered gunman whose primary focus was wreaking vengeance upon the agents responsible for his father's murder demonstrated how completely individual potential could be wasted through governmental policies that prioritized immediate tactical objectives over long-term social welfare and community stability. The intelligence and moral sensitivity that John had worked so hard to cultivate in his son were channeled not toward constructive purposes, but rather toward the planning and execution of retribution that would inevitably perpetuate the cycles of violence that institutional approaches to law enforcement had supposedly been designed to eliminate through superior organization and legal authority. The shooting of Agent Ross, that marked the culmination of Jack's quest for revenge, was both deeply satisfying expression of justice finally achieved and tragic confirmation that governmental betrayal had succeeded in transforming another promising young person into exactly the kind of criminal that official propaganda used to justify harsh measures and violent responses to social problems that might have been prevented through policies that emphasized rehabilitation and community support rather than punishment and elimination. The bullet that ended Ross's life carried with it not merely Jack's personal grief and anger, but also the accumulated weight of institutional failures and moral compromises that had made such violence seem like the only available response to systemic injustice and bureaucratic arrogance. The aftermath of Ross's assassination left Jack facing the same kinds of choices and pressures that had defined his father's existence throughout his adult life. As government authorities predictably responded to the killing of a federal agent with increased determination to eliminate anyone connected to the Marston family, while Jack's own actions had demonstrated that he possessed both the motivation and the capacity to continue the cycle of retribution that his father's death had initiated. The young man who had once dreamed of education and legitimate career found himself transformed into exactly the kind of fugitive that his father had spent years trying to avoid becoming again, creating conditions where the peaceful alternatives that domestic life had once seemed to offer were replaced by the familiar patterns of violence and flight that had characterized the outlaw existence that John had hoped his family might escape through honest work and moral transformation. The ranch at Beecher's Hope, that was gradually reclaimed by weather and wilderness, served as monument both to the genuine achievements that individual virtue and family solidarity could produce under favorable circumstances, and to the fragility of such achievements when they lacked protection from institutional forces whose understanding of social problems was limited to administrative categories that bore little relationship to the complex realities of human moral development and community relationships. The buildings that John had constructed with his own hands slowly deteriorated without maintenance, while the fields he had cultivated returned to their natural state, creating a physical metaphor for how completely his efforts to build something lasting and meaningful had been undermined by government policies that viewed personal transformation not as achievement worthy of respect, but as inconvenience, requiring elimination. The stories that would eventually be told about John Marston and his family reflected both the genuine heroism of his final sacrifice and the tragic irony that his death had accomplished exactly the opposite of what he had hoped to achieve through his cooperation with federal authorities, as his elimination had not secured his family's safety and peaceful future, but rather had initiated new cycles of violence while providing his son with motivations for criminal activity that would inevitably lead to further conflicts with law enforcement agencies whose approach to such problems remained unchanged by any recognition of their own role in creating the conditions they claimed to be addressing through superior organization and legal authority. The legend that grew around John's memory emphasized his courage and loyalty, while necessarily omitting the complex moral compromises and institutional betrayals that had made his final sacrifice both necessary and ultimately futile, as means of protecting his family from the consequences of governmental policies that treated individual human beings as expendable resources to be utilized and discarded according to bureaucratic convenience, rather than respected as citizens deserving protection and opportunity for rehabilitation and moral growth. The simplified version of his story that entered popular mythology served political purposes that bore little relationship to the actual lessons that might have been learned from honest examination of how institutional power had systematically destroyed possibilities for redemption and peaceful resolution of conflicts that had their origins in social and economic conditions that government policies had helped to create and perpetuate. The children who would grow up in territories that had once been terrorized by outlaw gangs inherited not the peace and security that John's sacrifice was supposed to have purchased, but rather new forms of violence and institutional oppression that demonstrated how completely the opportunity for genuine social progress had been squandered through approaches to law enforcement that prioritized elimination over rehabilitation and administrative efficiency over human dignity and community welfare. The schools and churches that were eventually built in regions where the Vanderlinde gang had once operated served populations whose understanding of justice and governmental authority had been shaped by witnessing how institutional power operated when it was unconstrained by moral consideration or constitutional principle, creating foundations for social development that emphasized compliance and fear rather than civic participation and democratic accountability. As you drift towards sleep, remember that every sunrise offers the chance to be better than we were the day before, and that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is simply choose to stay when leaving would be so much easier. John's story teaches us that love endures long after the legends fade, that individual transformation remains possible, even in circumstances that seem designed to prevent such growth, and that the choice to prioritize family and human relationships over abstract principles and institutional loyalty represents a form of moral courage that transcends the immediate circumstances that make such choices necessary or meaningful. The frontier is quiet now. The gunshots have faded to whispers on the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a child learns to read by lamplight, carrying forward the hope that his father died to protect. The peace that John Marston never found for himself lives on in the possibility that future generations might learn from his example to choose forgiveness over vengeance, rehabilitation over punishment, and human dignity over institutional efficiency, creating conditions where individual moral transformation can flourish without being destroyed by political forces that view such transformation as threat rather than achievement worthy of celebration and protection. Rest easy, knowing that love endures long after the legends fade, and that every ending is also a beginning for someone else's story, carrying forward the eternal promise that individual choices matter and that hope remains possible, even in circumstances that seem designed to crush the human spirit and eliminate possibilities for redemption and moral growth.